Hey guys, welcome out to Revolution this morning. We're just starting a little bit late this morning just due to I've just recently been over in Pakistan and have been very busy, and so had lots of late nights, and usually going to Pakistan and coming back was a bit of an ordeal. And so yeah, it's just a normal thing, stopping over in Abu Dhabi, going to Pakistan, being very busy there, and then coming back. And so I did the first part of this on Monday night. Now, I had been away for 14 hours. The next day I was away for 15 hours. And so this week's been almost an absolute write-off with trying to get some study done. But last night I just started looking at this, and I've been quite fascinated with Matthew chapter 1 verse 23 for a long time. And I guess because it tends to put me in a position where I'm making assumptions based upon evidence, but I'm making assumptions that a lot of people don't usually make. And so most of the time when it comes to this reading in the text of Receptus, people just go with what Scrivener has. People just go with what Stephanus has. But when it comes to what Bazer has, a lot of people don't like to go there, and they just assume that he made a mistake and the King James translators just corrected that. So there are a few places where the King James translators deviate from the 1598 text of Bazer. And most guys like myself, D.A. Waite, Kirk de Vitro, say there's roughly about 20 places that are translatable that make a difference. And so that's why someone like Edward Hills says that the Greek text underlying the King James Version is its own unique text, but it just never got printed. And so that's why Scrivener, years later, he's printed that text. And so obviously we have other texts like the Elzevas, and pretty much every Greek text was a TR-based Greek text up until Lockman. He was the first one to print a non-TR text. But at the end of the day, a lot of people simply go with what would be translated as "they shall call," which is how the King James has it. And this is basically a reading which is in the majority of TR editions, but Bazer has, it's the singular, "thou shalt call." Now we're going to look at this, and because I believe it's the correct reading, and I think the King James translators, what they did is they gave us some information to show us that this particular Greek word can be translated plural in the context. So we're going to look at a few other places where this has happened. Now, I did a video on this, I think about a year and a half ago, and I just listened to it this morning, sort of refresh my memory, because I went through Matthew chapter 1 and a little bit of Matthew chapter 2. I am going to get back into doing that because I really enjoyed that, just going verse by verse through the New Testament. So I sort of got stuck on I think it was Matthew chapter 2 verse 3, and then I ended up getting involved in the Revelation 16:5 debates of James White and all that, but I won't go into that. But it just took all my time from just going verse by verse. And so I did look at this issue, and on my website I have quite a lot of information about this. Now, if anyone enjoys these videos, likes to what I do, usually it just comes down to information coming my way. And so, say when I first looked at this verse, I was looking at Jan Kranz's book many years ago, and I would just look at things and look at the way he translated things and look at what he's saying, and I'm sort of trying to build a case for the TR, looking at the accusations against it, but also putting his point of view there. And so it was interesting, usually when James White brings something up, I mightn't have much on my website to talk about. Sometimes James White will bring up, say, Revelation 14:1. Now, I've personally gone through a lot of these things, read things in my own time and become fully convinced in my mind about certain things. But then 4 or 5 years later, I can't even remember why I came to such a conclusion or what I read that got me there. Or, in the middle of the night, you're looking at some internet page, it's like, that's the answer. And you give it up because you're satisfied. But with this particular text in Matthew chapter 1, verse 23, I've collected quite a lot of material. If you go to my website, which is tr.org.au, you can easily navigate through the front page of the site and go to Matthew chapter 1, and then from there, if you just click the numbers that are in Matthew chapter 1, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 down the left-hand side, you can click on number 23, and you'll see what I've got there. So just recently I put up some pictures of Codex Bazer, which is the text named after Bazer. Now, it seems like we make these words like Bazer and Bezer. I know James White calls him Theodore Bazer. I tend to think his name was Theodore Bazer, but it could just be Americanization of things. And it seems like we name the texts that he had for a while and he gave to, I think it was the British Library, we call it Bazer. So there's like this distinction, and I guess it's like the distinction between the Textus Receptus seems to be the printed text, and the traditional text seems to be the manuscripts that are TR type texts. And so we make these distinctions, and whether they're correct or not, I mean, time will tell, or someone will write a definitive book about these sort of things. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to get straight into it, because I think last time I did waffle on a little bit, and I didn't let James White talk much. I think I only let James speak for 5 minutes, and I did an hour and I think it was a half of talking. And so, but the problem is sometimes James White says so many things wrong. You have to, you feel like there's someone out there watching who doesn't know anything about this, and you've really got to back everything up, and you've got to explain things. But I do tend to rabbit trail a bit, so I'm just going to let him speak. Now, hopefully this volume is up full ball. Yes. And hopefully you guys can hear this in the recording. And so if there is a problem there, I can get a speaker, but hopefully this will be loud enough. Here we go.
So anyway, wanted to give you an example from the book and get into a little text here. And this has, before you tune out, some of you just get really bored by stuff like this. I understand we cover stuff that nobody else covers, okay? That's just how we've done it. Some people are geeking out right now, and you're firing up accordance, and you're got your TR over here, and your Nessie Island over there, and you're telling the kids to get out of the room, and I know. And the rest of you are just leaving the room. That's what's going on. But this is a relevant text in for a lot of apologetic reasons, dealing with a lot of other groups. So stick with me here. We all know the text of Matthew 1:23, and it is a citation, of course, from the prophet Isaiah in chapter 7. Behold, the virgin shall be with child, and shall bear a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel, which translated means God with us. And what is interesting is the discussion that Dr. Kranz provides regarding Theodore Bazer. I've been using his name already, but Theodore Bazer is Calvin's successor in Geneva. And he began producing, and again, just like Erasmus, his primary focus was on the Latin translation. The Greek was just sort of there.
So I just want to start with that. His primary focus was the Latin translation. This is just another thing that James White loves to do. I mean, imagine if the first book that James White wrote, I think it was maybe a book about Mormons or Catholics or something like that. And so imagine if any other book that he's written after that, say, the Trinity book, if I said, well, his main focus is Mormonism, it's not the Trinity. That's a totally secondary thing for James White, is a Trinity. He doesn't really even care about the Trinity. He just wants to show where Mormons are wrong. I mean, that's a really unfair representation, but this is what James White engages in all the time. He just says, the Greek was just a secondary afterthought. And even right up to Theodore Bezer, he's just, he's printed, these major editions, and he's got all these other minor editions as well of, sometimes it's only Greek, sometimes it's only Latin, but he's got footnotes all through these, but he's only concerned about Latin. Why? Well, because James White says so, and this is one of the things where you just have to take James White's say-so on this, or, perhaps he's been reading through Jan Kranz, and Jan Kranz has said this somewhere, but at the end of the day, we've got to watch this, because this is exactly what Bart Ehrman engages in. He gets into the mind of these scholars, or, he'll say, oh, this is what Erasmus really wanted to do, or this scribe who did, Codex D, he thought this, or he had a bad day here, and when he was writing this, he was trying to promote Trinitarianism, and we don't know that. I mean, I've worked on translations, I've translated things, I've worked things out, and some people could see that I'm trying to squeeze things into the text, but I'm not. I've just gone through and faithfully done it. And so this is what I believe Bezer was doing, Erasmus was doing, and so far we've seen that Jan Kranz will even retranslate the Latin of Bezer. Other people modern day people in the 1980s have translated Erasmus and Bezer, but he will retranslate, Erasmus, and make it sound like he doesn't really believe the Book of Revelation is canonical, it's deuterocanonical, and it's like that's not what he's saying there. And so this is one of the difficult things is these experts, the ones who James White is going to, deeply influenced, just like Bart Ehrman is. Bart Ehrman is the editor of this book that James White's promoting to destroy the Textus Receptus, which is absolutely ironic. But how do they know that this is what Bezer wanted, and that he was only interested in Latin? And it just doesn't make any sense for him to bring out so many Greek editions. And I think it's very unfair for him to say that, and he needs to be very specific when he says this. Where did he get that information? Kranz said this and that. No, he's just saying, he's just throwing things out there like, they could be in Kranz's book, or they could be just something I'm making up now, or they could be, something that I've heard somewhere else before, but you just never really know. He's not footnoting these things. And so, I understand everyone does that, but, I'll say things and you have no idea where I read it or where I got it from or whatever. But it's like, I'm not in the position like James White where I'm, basically a full frontal attack on the Textus Receptus position, and, with just speculation and just, they weren't interested in the Greek, they're interested in the Latin. Well, that's a huge thing to say. That's massive. And so you have to back that up. You can't just throw it out there. And where'd you get that from? Kranz? Is it your own understanding? Is this like something that Bart Ehrman, when he was editing this, when he's working through stuff as an editor, that he suggested? Is this something? Are you parroting something that maybe Bart Ehrman has interjected there? We don't know. And so that's where it comes down to James White being the go-to guru, the guy you go to for the reading. You have no idea what the reading is. You just got to go to James White. He loves that sort of stuff. And when it comes to scholarly information, he is exactly the same. He'll just throw something out there, And then, he might point to a book or might point to a reference or whatever, but a lot of the time it's just stuff off the top of his head because he's right. He just knows that you're wrong, and it doesn't really matter what he's saying. You are going to be wrong. No matter what sort of proof you provide. You could provide something that just shows him that it's the exact opposite of what he said, and it's just right in front of his face, and he would just ignore that because he has a barrow to push, and we're here to keel the wheelbarrow that he's pushing. So just got some comments here. I'm just going to read them. Erasmus and Bazer, so this is Stephen Hayes. Hey, Stephen. Erasmus and Bazer certainly did love Latin, and they wanted to improve the Latin translations of the New Testament, but their extensive work in the Greek was because they knew the importance of the Greek manuscripts in forming the basis of their Latin translations, and that is absolutely spot on. The Reformers understood that the Greek was the primary thing. So you have the Greek, but they understand also that in any manuscript tradition, whether it's in the Latin, whether it's in the Coptic, whatever language, that errors can creep into a text. And so with the Greek, what they had first was the Latin. They were looking to the Greek to correct the Latin. And so that's what Erasmus did. And so then, with the Latin text, that shone light upon the Greek. And so using the Latin text and using the early church writings, they were able to say, and also commentaries and other versions and things, but primarily the Latin and the Latin and Greek early church writings of people like Chrysostom and Jerome and things like that. They were able to look at the Greek and to polish the Greek. So that's why, the majority text or the Byzantine, priority sort of group, they're looking at the bulk of manuscripts, but people like Erasmus, Stephanus, and Bazer and the King James translators, they understood that the Greek had become slightly corrupted. And so that's why they're going outside of that, looking at other things and saying, well, how did this get into the Latin? How did this get into the Syriac? How did this get into the Arabic? And so they're looking at all these other readings and they're looking at the Greek, and then they're saying, hang on, we can see where they've made certain errors in the Greek. And so they're working on the Greek from primarily Latin. And this is how Erasmus would recognize things like homoiouton. He would look at Latin manuscripts. And so what we're looking at is during this period was the massive transition from manuscripts to print. And so, some people could have easily recognized these things, created manuscripts that agree with Erasmus and Bazer and all the rest of it, but they've just done one or a handful of manuscripts like that, where other people, they don't realize it's an error and they just continually copy it, and it just becomes a majority. And so that's why the majority text is the basis for the Textus Receptus, but it's not the be-all, end-all. It's not just like we just count heads and you go, okay, we've got 1,000 here, let's just go with that. Sometimes the reading, we're also looking at grammatical understanding. And so sometimes the Greek doesn't make any sense. And so when the Greek doesn't make any sense, there's a good chance that there has been a corruption there. Sometimes, homoiouton, parablepsis, all sorts of things can creep into a text, and these things need to be taken into consideration. And that's what Erasmus was doing, Stephanus, Bazer. These guys were working on the text like that. And so, great point. Usually there's three main pillars for the Textus Receptus, and the main one is the Greek, and the Byzantine majority text is the main pillar. But then there's the Latin, and then there's the Greek and Latin early church writers. Now, that's the closed class of witnesses. Outside of that, of the closed class of witnesses, then you have, like Theodore Bazer, he went and looked at the Syriac because his good friend Tremellius had done a Syriac translation. Then his nephew Junius, he had worked on the Arabic, so they were looking at Arabic manuscripts, they were looking at Ethiopic manuscripts, all sorts of different languages to basically shed light upon what they were doing. And so they were looking at the Textus Receptuses in these languages. So there was a Textus Receptus in Latin, there's a Textus Receptus in Greek, there's a Textus Receptus in all these languages. And so they were looking at these to shine light upon what they were doing. So hopefully that helps people to understand what was going on.
But it was never his intention to collate mountains of manuscripts and do all the rest of that, to create a critical Greek text or anything like that. That was not his intention. That wasn't Erasmus's intention. The Greek was a necessary thing to be dealing with. But the funny thing is, the TR came into existence by three different stages, each of which was more concerned about the Latin. Now, by the time of Beza, since Beza is post-Calvin, now you're getting the third generation reformers, and now you're starting to get into the situation where the reformed world is now having to do intellectual battle with the Jesuits and the post-Trent Catholic resurgence, what's called the Counter-Reformation. And so you see some of that in Beza. For example, there's a Beza's primary concern is harmonization, defense. Interestingly enough, not against, you would think in those days, against the Muslims, Roman Catholics, defending against the Roman Catholics.
It just seems strange that James would say that, but I understand this is one of the key things that sets Beza apart from Stephanus and from Erasmus. I believe Erasmus did do this, and Stephanus, but Beza tends to say, for example, Luke chapter 2, verse 22, when it's talking about her purification. Now, he understands that the scripture does not contradict itself. It's not going to contradict the Old Testament. You're not going to have, a prophecy says, a child will be born in Bethlehem and he's born somewhere else. It's, that's where these things have got to line up. And so that's one of the things that Beza was very concerned with, was matching up the Old Testament with the New Testament. Now, again, his friend Tremelius, he had worked on a Hebrew Bible as well as the Syriac. He'd done the Syriac in Hebrew letters. And so Beza, Tremelius, and Janius, they all worked together on Latin Bibles. And so eventually they had a premier Latin Bible, I think it was in 1579, and that became the premier Latin Bible for the Protestant movement for about 300 years. And it was pretty much absolutely identical to what the King James is. If you would translate that into English, you would get the King James. And so Beza's worked on that. Beza's also worked on the Geneva Bible, English Bible. And so it's a huge deal. He eventually worked on notes and things for that. And so, these guys knew Hebrew. These guys knew Syriac. They're looking at Old Testament, and they're trying to work out, hang on, in the Old Testament it says this, but in the New Testament it says this. And they're weighing up that whole concept of the Septuagint. There was an interesting guy called William Whitaker who mentioned that the Septuagint had been almost completely corrupted. If it was used by the apostles or whatever, it's become almost completely corrupted in our day because it just differs from the Hebrew so much. And so that's one of the things where people were skeptical of the Septuagint. Now, I understand that in the introduction of the King James Bible, the translators to the readers, they do talk about the Septuagint, but it was questioned in that era, and so scholars question that, and that's exactly what Whitaker said. He said scholars question whether there be a wholesale LXX, because even the stories around it, the translators, 6 from each tribe, 72 translators coming together, doing their thing. It's just a myth, and most people admit that that's a myth, but it's still called the Septuagint. It's still referred to. It's there's been flimsy evidence that it's a BC document, but people just still run with that speculation, and people just assume that what we've got today, you just fire up, like he's saying, your accordance or whatever, and you look it up, that's what they had back then, and it's simply not. And what you have there, it differs from the Hebrew so amazingly that it's become corrupted. If it ever was from back there, a lot of people just think it's the fifth column of Origen's hexapla. But anyway, I'll let James continue.
And so that becomes very, very important in his thinking and how he is dealing with that. So what's fascinating is there is no consistent textual critical methodology that can be assigned to Erasmus, Stephanus, and Bazer. That's why I have said, and that's why that I never played that. Oh man, I missed what would be one of the most enjoyable things. I do have it around.
So anyway, before he rabbit trails, he's basically saying there's no consistent methodology. You got Erasmus there, and then you got Stephanus, and you got Bazer, and they all use sort of different methodology. And on some verses they'll use one type of textual critical principles, and on another verse they'll use other things and go to the Hebrew or whatever. So what about the text of Tischendorf, Tregelles, Gracebach, Luckman, the text that has basically come through the critical text guys up till Westcott and Hort? So would you say that they were all using the same sort of principles? When Westcott and Hort are there using basically Vaticanus as their primary manuscript and looking at Sinaiticus as well. But then all of a sudden you got this papyri that James White said, the papyri, if you don't get into the papyri, you don't know anything. You basically, everything before the papyri is just a waste of time even knowing about. That's old. That's like horse and cart. We've got the Ferrari now. We got the papyri. But other guys say the papyri didn't really change much about the text. So you got Westcott and Hort. They didn't have the papyri. They had a handful of them, but it didn't really change much of their thinking. And then all of a sudden papyri came, and James White saying it's a game changer. But then you've got the United Bible Society Nestle Aland text, and so you've got these other guys coming together with the Roman Catholics, the Jesuits involved in that, and then you got these other editions. And so where's the consistency in all that? You know what I mean? It's like he's trying to make out that Erasmus and Bazer and Stephanus were just off on totally different planets, and they just didn't have this cohesion. Well, I fail to see where his position has this cohesion. And James White's answer to these things are usually you're just saying, oh, you too. Well, isn't that the whole thing? You're not just demoting the text receptors, you're promoting the critical text methodology. And it's why are you only pointing out that our one is inconsistent when you just have to look in the mirror and your one's inconsistent? It's just why are you only throwing up the dirt on our side, and there's plenty of dirt on your side you can throw up? And so this is the inconsistency of James White. He's only pointing out things in our camp, when even in this verse, Matthew chapter 1 verse 23, why doesn't he do a whole show about how the Revised Standard Version changed the word virgin there to young maiden, I think it was, or young girl or whatever? Why doesn't he do a thing on that? Why doesn't he do a thing on how then they tried to fix it and they left it in the New Testament, but they changed it in the Old Testament, creating a contradiction, and how this has affected modern versions? He won't even touch it. He won't even go, and this is huge. It affects the virgin birth. It affects lots of things. Why doesn't he talk about these sort of issues in the critical text camp? Because he's throwing up microscopic bits of dust, trying to get it as close to your face as possible. So you're thinking, man, the TR position has all these problems. When it's because his problems are so big, they're like clusters of horse poo. They're so big, and they affect doctrines. They have just muddied the waters. Our stuff is just, when you examine them closely, they're almost non-existent. Like this variant here. The only reason I've been interested in it is because I've become very interested in different types of TRs. And so I look at Erasmus, look at his editions, and then I look at, why did Bazer change from this to that? And to me, it's fascinating. And sometimes Bazer changed and he didn't need to. And the King James translators mopped that up and cleaned it up in the English. And, would have been great if they did a Greek parallel Bible, but they didn't. But, James White's trying to make out this is just a huge deal. We're going to see this is just a storm in a teacup, where he's there with tropical cyclone, Katrina around his head, and just like trying to point out our little storm in a teacup, which is sort of just scholarly stuff. It doesn't really even affect the reading. He's going to try to make out this huge deal about Matthew chapter 1 verse 23. Well, even in the same verse, he's the guys who he defends that they've attacked the virgin birth. They've attacked the scripture. It brought shock to the Christian world that, oh, hang on, it doesn't say virgin anymore. It says young girl. Maybe she wasn't a virgin and all this stuff, and it just brought out all this controversy, and it was huge. He doesn't talk about that. He's not interested in that. He's interested in pushing his barrow. So, anyway, we'll let him continue.
On here. But remember I linked, and I'm going to have to pull this up because I totally forgot about it. This was when I was in Holland. Dr. Gene Kim, that brilliant man from the King James Only Church over there. We had played the link of him bringing up my name and then doing that weird thing in front of the camera. You're like, okay, all right. And then the guy sitting there with his Bible, fanning him because he's on fire, and you're like, this really goes on in church, huh? Okay, wow. Anyway, he put out this video that was about 21 minutes long, I think. And he's just ripping on me. I mean, it is. For a while, I said, we see here the maturity of a 12-year-old. The 12-year-old taunting. It's more like 8-year-old. 12 is a teenager, and they know how to use. No, this is about 8. His maturity level during the taunts literally are things like liar, liar, pants on fire. That's about 8 years old. Right around there, you think, yeah. Go with 10? Okay, all right. Yeah, that's a nice in between. Just childish. The man is just has the maturity of a tiny little child. And it's shocking to listen to, but I don't think a minute goes by where there's not something about wicked, vile men, stupid. I mean, just it is sad to watch. So yeah, you've got those folks, but he's trying to deal with this type of stuff too. And I'm trying to differentiate. I try to differentiate between the different groups, but you need to help out by coming up with better argumentation about this stuff. But the thing that prompted his video was he was responding to my challenge to the True Love Riddle group, where I said, here's what you guys need to do. I challenge you to come up with a consistent textual critical methodology that, when applied to the manuscripts we possess today, would produce the Textus Receptus. Well, he just goes nuts on this. He clearly has no idea what any of this conversation is. He hasn't read any of this stuff. He's probably never read Kron's, obviously. And so he doesn't even know what we're talking about. He's really not a part of this conversation. But he takes that isolated thing, ignores its context, and then proceeds to rip and shred on me. All to his own embarrassment, obviously, but his people are never going to watch a program like this. Anyways, they're too afraid to.
Okay, so this Gene Kim, I think I've watched maybe one or two of his videos, and I can't really even remember whether I liked him or not. I don't really know his position, but I will look at his stuff because he seems to be a name that's coming up in the ranks. Just like with Steven Anderson, I went through a time when I listened to pretty much absolutely everything that he was bringing out, just to get a taste of what he was doing, and also because there was a young man who I was trying to help who had been deeply influenced by Steven Anderson, and I was trying to stop him from committing suicide almost every day. And so for about a year, he was saying that he wanted to commit suicide. And so because, Steven Anderson says if you're saved, you can commit suicide and you go straight to heaven. But, I don't recommend you do that, sort of thing. He's like, and if you're homosexual, just commit suicide anyway, because you're doomed. So this guy had been involved in a few things and stuff, and he was just like, oh, well, I guess the only answer is commit suicide. And I'm like, don't listen to this guy, he's a snake. But, some people, they gravitate towards error, and that's the unfortunate thing. There's error everywhere. It's almost like sometimes with people who I've been trying to influence over the years, if I said, look, whatever you do, don't have strawberry yogurt coated muesli bars, they would, like the next day, like, I've got to have a strawberry coat. Yeah, it's like they've just got to run to whatever you warn them against. And it's almost like with this issue, with the TR and stuff, you say all this stuff and people are like, I've got my New Living Translation and that's it. Where if you actually hadn't mentioned anything, they'd probably gravitate towards like a New King James or something like that. But because you said it, they go the opposite direction. And I think that shows unregeneracy when there's just a basic truth and people run from it and run straight into the arms of error. You're just like, hang on, aren't these people interested in truth at all? But anyway. So yeah, Gene Kim, Steven Anderson, these guys, I'm sort of trying to keep up to date with what they're doing. See, Anderson's brought out a new movie about Jordan and things like that, and so I'll have to watch all that. I've watched his one about the rapture. I've watched his one about, and unfortunately, his one about the Bible is actually a pretty good introduction. There's probably 80% of it is very good because it's just information, and even some of the information I've been putting on Facebook for years and years, and things that I stump people on, I noticed he was using a little bit of that, and it makes me wonder whether he's actually sort of followed my Text to Receptors page on Facebook, because usually I bring up the Galatians chapter 5 verse 12, because people say, oh, you're a King James guy, you're a legalist. I'm like, okay, so you think I'm a legalist, should I castrate myself according to your NIV or ESV or whatever they're trying to promote? And they're like, what do you mean? And I show them the scripture where it says, Paul desired that those who were coming against the Galatians and trying to impose legalism, that they would go and castrate themselves. It's just the most bizarre reading. And in the King James it says that they were cut off. It's like disfellowshipped and all the rest of it. But yeah, these modern versions are just ridiculous. And so what it does, it shows that these modern versions slander Paul, make him out to be this psycho who hopes that these legalists, say like Seventh-day Adventists or whatever, I hope they go and just castrate themselves. Who would think that? And then it also shows that I say to them, so do you want me to do that? It was just this thing that I'd back people into a corner, and it was usually like it's like everyone's got a trump card, and so they'd corner you on something. I'd say, okay, so you think I should castrate myself? And they're like, what do you mean? And it's like, well, look in your Bible, and they'd read it and be shocked, and it was I've had lengthy Facebook conversations and brought that up, and then the conversation stopped. And they've gone elsewhere because they realise, hang on, that's a pretty heavy thing for the Apostle Paul to wish that someone would do that. And so, yeah, anyway, Steven Anderson brings that up in his movie as well, which is, I was like, yeah, cool, but I don't know, maybe we got it from the same place or whatever. But, yeah, trying to keep up to date with these guys. So, anyway, back to what James White's saying. So I haven't looked at the Gene Kim stuff that he's talking about, but I will go through his stuff maybe in the next month or so.
To find out that he's full of hot air. So it was that challenge, though, that I made to that group. I mean, they're literally saying on Facebook, to be confessional, we need to have a biblical method of textual criticism. I'm like, what is that? Where does the Bible give a biblical method of textual criticism?
This is where James White gets an F from me. One of the first things I did when I started doing these videos was I did a sermon on what the Bible says about itself. So the Bible talks about how it is infallible. It's for all generations, and however you want to interpret Psalm 12. I interpret it as the words what are pure forever for all generation. Some people are like, "Oh, the people are pure for all generations." To me, that doesn't sit right. It doesn't. The closest antecedent there is words. And but either way, even if you left that verse out, there's verses like, "Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words shall by no means pass away. The grass withers, the flower fades, but the word of our God shall stand forever." Yet when you go through and you compile all these words together, there are some verses that say, "Teach this to your children and to their children, and from all generations forever." And so you think, oh, the word of God must have to be around forever for that to happen. And so you create a biblical mindset of what the Bible says about itself. And usually, there's the attacks from modern versions against these verses as well. And so you've got to sort of navigate through all that. But there is enough in there, even in modern versions, to show that there will be a book in the future, in this time here, that we will basically call the Word of God, and it will be the words of God, and we will be judged according to that. And it's the words of Jesus, and heaven and earth will pass away, but his words will not pass away, and all this sort of stuff. And so these the Bible talks about itself. The Bible explains about itself. So when James White's saying you need to all the TR guys, Riddle, True Love, and guys on a Facebook page, they're saying, James White needs to have a biblical methodology of textual criticism. Basically, we're saying those things, which is having an understanding of the preservation of God's word. If Jesus said, point blank, "Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away," that doesn't mean his words will pass away. It means they won't. If they're for all generations, and I'm not just talking about Psalm chapter 12 either, I'm talking about other verses where it clearly says the word. Read Psalm chapter 119 and write down the things that it says about the word of God. There's so much to do with the word of God, and so much written about the word of God in the Bible itself, that you really need to do a study on all that first before you start engaging in the sort of stuff that James White's doing, because he doesn't seem to have a clue about these things. He's like, "What do you mean a biblical mindset about this?" Well, having an understanding of what the Bible says, knowing that God won't contradict himself, that God will say one thing in the New Testament and he won't just Now, we understand that there are concepts that override. So say in the New Testament, we no longer have a temple. We no longer slaughter animals. We have Jesus. He's overridden all that. So it's not a contradiction. It's just a further development. We have a horse and cart in the Old Testament. You got a Ferrari in the New Testament, sort of thing. It's like there's been a progression there. And so we understand that. But there are things like, the Bible says God cannot lie. So God won't lie. He's not going to lie in the New Testament. But, in the Old Testament, he's going to tell the truth all the time. There's going to be this consistency with the character of God. There's going to be certain things that are concrete that God can't deviate from, that he won't deviate from. It's his character. It's his nature. It's what he does. And so understanding those things will give you a good biblical understanding of the Word of God. Because if it's saying something in the Old Testament and it's totally contradicted in the New Testament, and it's like some textual variant, it's like, well, obviously there's an error here. There's something wrong here. And so this is the sort of stuff that Bazer was working on. He was working through harmonization, making sure that the Bible matched up with itself. And so when you're working on a printed text, so up until then it was manuscripts, it's not like they're inventing the Bible. They're just going through, looking at all these manuscripts. And it sort of dawned on me the other day. James White was making out that these guys just had flimsy little evidence. Erasmus only had a handful of manuscripts and all the rest of it. Up until that era, they didn't have books. They only had manuscripts. So how did these guys get educated? How did Erasmus learn all his Latin and all his Greek and know all about the early church writers and know about commentaries and history and all that? Through manuscripts. These guys were experts in manuscripts. Now we just sort of take photos of them and put them on an internet page somewhere, and that makes us all better because we have all this access. It makes sense that they would have way more manuscripts back then than we do now. Because basically up until the age of printing, manuscript writing stopped and they started printing. There were a few places where they were doing a little bit here and there, but it basically stopped, and then they're printing things, and so the whole concept of manuscripts just stopped. So here's these guys right at that period of time, and that's all they would have had to look at. They weren't going and buying a book and, I found this book with this reading in it. No, they were looking at manuscripts. And just for example, the Complutensian Polyglot, which was the first ever printed edition of the Greek in 1514, this was done by Cardinal Ximenes in Spain. And so they printed 600 copies of the New Testament. Now, there's only 123 that survived till this day. So say we're looking at 505 years later. So say roughly 500 years of use. 80% of those books, printed books, have just vanished. So in World War II, there was 1 million biblical manuscripts that got destroyed. 1 million. So we're looking at libraries being bombed, churches getting burnt down, all this sort of stuff. Things getting looted, stolen, and just lost, buried in the mud, and people are going to come back later, but they die, and all the rest of it. And so, 1 million biblical manuscripts. So if you think just over 500 years, if there's going to be that amount of loss, 80%, if you think if we've got, say, 6,000 manuscripts today, it makes sense to think that there's, tens of thousands of manuscripts in Erasmus's time. It just makes sense to think that way. And also, before that, 500 years before that, there would have been way more, and so, or in a sense where, obviously a lot were written between those times, but, James White sort of grabs the evidence figure that we have for today. It's like, we got these, 5,500 manuscripts today, and it's almost like assumed that's all we ever had. There was probably, 100,000 Greek manuscripts, but we've only got that much to work with today. And so even with the Reuchlins Codex that, Erasmus gets slanderously, it gets slanderously parroted about Erasmus, that's the only manuscript he used for Revelation, which is a load of rubbish. But even that went missing for hundreds of years. Then they found it, and so manuscripts do go missing all the time. And there's lots of manuscripts that Erasmus would have had, Bazer would have had, Stephanus would have had, the King James translators would have had. Like, when you look at the work that the King James translators did, a lot of that was burnt in the Great Fire of London in 1666. And so there was something like 400 acres of London burnt to the ground. And with that was, manuscripts and books and, commentaries, and just gone forever. So who knows, and James White admits that there wasn't this huge cataloguing system. Yeah, we've got the internet now, we put it on there and it's sort of there forever. But back then the libraries did have cataloguing systems, but you sort of had to visit them and you had to go there and know your stuff. Now, he tries to make out that was detrimental to the Textus Receptus, that, they didn't have this cataloguing system. But, what these libraries just didn't know what they had. They would have been going through it and looking at it, and other people are visiting the library looking at it, and they're like, what's this book? And so they write it down. It's like, when you read the annotations of Erasmus and Bazer, They know where manuscripts are. They know what to call these manuscripts. It's just, James White saying, they didn't have categories, so in other words, they weren't numbered like a Nessel Island number, and so they didn't know what to do. It's just ridiculous. These manuscripts had names. It's like, okay, we're looking at the Royal Codex. It's in this library, or it's in this collection, or whatever. And so, yes, it wasn't a global, like everyone knows where these are. It was certain people knew where these are, but it was enough to get by, and enough for Europe to go, okay, well, that manuscript's in the library in Paris, this one's in London, this one's here and there. And so this whole concept of they didn't have his cataloging system is ridiculous. But when they have something like a fire in London, that's all lost. All that information is just lost. And so you don't have people who have copied and gone through it, and but then again, I think that even if all the manuscripts were destroyed, we would have probably enough in, say, things like the Walton's Polyglot, the London Polyglot, the Plantin Polyglot, Hutter's work, all the TR editions and everything, to sort of basically get a good understanding of the manuscripts that they used. And so, anyway, I'm going to let James talk again.
Interestingly, Kim tries, and what he does is he looks at Antioch and Alexandria. And Alexandria is bad, Antioch's good. King James came from Antioch, it didn't. That's a bunch of baloney, and that's our textual critical methodology. Well, that's not a textual critical methodology. That doesn't explain whether you should be looking at the most difficult reading. It doesn't talk about homoteleuton. It doesn't talk about scribal habits. It doesn't talk about evaluation of manuscript weights, evidences, none of that stuff. It's not a methodology. That's because he doesn't do that kind of stuff, so he wouldn't know that. But the challenge to the TR guys is you need to do that, and you can't. It is impossible. And the reason it's impossible is if you just know anything about Erasmus, Stephanus, and Beza, and that's why I said this is such a valuable resource, then you discover that they used different methodologies. They had different intentions. They had different purposes. And so, since the TR is a mishmash, because remember, the TR that people are running around using today from the Trinitarian Bible Society, this is a mishmash. It is a Greek text based upon English translation. It's based upon the textual choices made by the differing committees, not one committee. People always say, all the 54 scholars.
Okay, so just before he goes on to a whole bunch of stuff, he said the TR is a mishmash. Like I said, if you get the Latin Bible that Theodore Bazer worked on, his good friend Tremellius and Tremellius's nephew Janius, if you get their Latin Bible, it's basically identical to the King James. Bazer, expert in manuscripts, expert in Latin, in Greek. Tremellius, expert in Syriac and in Hebrew. Janius, expert in all experts in Latin, but Janius especially expert in Arabic. So these guys all working together, they create a Latin text, which is pretty much exactly the same as the King James, and it is the standard for like 300 years in the Protestant Latin Bible. James White's sort of like, if you look at these guys, they have these inconsistent readings. Well, at the end of the day, if you just look at what Elia Hutter had in his 1599 Nuremberg Polyglot, which was the Dodecalogue, which is a 12-language parallel Bible, which has like Hebrew and Spanish and Italian and English. And when you look at that text that he's got there, it's pretty much on par with the King James. It's not that, like, the King James is just this new fandangled thing. When you look at the Greek he has there, it's pretty much just the TR Greek. It's when you look at Bazer, the difference between Theodore Bazer's 1598 and the King James is about 20 translatable things, because the King James translators were superior to Theodore Bezer, because Theodore Bezer had created his ceiling became the King James translators platform. And so they were able to work with what he did. And he had lots of footnotes. He left lots of information about why he came to certain conclusions. So these, there was roughly about 60 people who worked on the King James translation. And James White would just write them off. They're all just, all in different committees, all scattered around the place. He has no idea how the King James came to be. They actually translated it 14 times. Now, let me explain. There was 6 committees. They're all based just around England, and they all could easily have contact with each other. It's not like, they didn't have a fax machine, they didn't have a phone, and so they never contacted. This just shows you the ignorance of one of America's greatest apologists, James White. This is his ignorance on the greatest Bible ever. So what would happen is, just say you had 10 people in a committee, because it's just a round number, there's 6 committees, so we'll just say there's 10 in each, just to make it easier. So you have those 10 people, so they all individually did a translation on the bit that they were told to work on. So say if they were to do the Gospels and the Book of Revelation, they all individually went home. They had the Geneva Bible there, the Bishop's Bible there, they had Greek, and they had all these other translations. And they've worked out, and they're trying to impress these other scholars too, because these, some of them, like say Henry Saville, who worked on those particular portions of the Gospels and Revelation, he was tutoring the Queen of England, Elizabeth. It's like probably one of the greatest linguists in the land. He's on your team. You're not just going to come up with something you fudged, So they all did 10 different translations. They all brought it to the rest of the committee. They all looked at these other translations. Then they had to amalgamate them all into one. So that's just what every committee did. Then they were to send that off to the other committees. So there's 5 other committees. They all get a copy. And they're all to read it, evaluate it, and send back information about, why did you do this and why did you do that? Or perhaps it's like, hang on, that doesn't match up with what we've translated it, Passover here, and you've got Easter here, and that's, I can see that's in a New Testament context, and Passover's in an Old Testament context. I see what you're doing there. They're working these things out. And so, and if there was any place of, obscurity, they were able to send it to any learned person in the land for their advice. And so here you have 60 scholars working like this. And so James White saying that basically these people were just isolated, they didn't know what they were doing, they didn't have contact with one another. It's just a lie. Let's just face it. For someone who's written a book called The King James Only Controversy, you would think that he knew about the King James. He knows hardly anything about the King James. He knows hardly anything about Erasmus, about Bezer. He knows slander about these people. He knows slander about the King James translators. He will say, things about King James, and a lot of anti-King James people say King James was a homosexual. He was the only king in England he was the only king in Europe at that time who actually slept in the same bed as his wife. Usually they had separate chambers. He had 8 children. He actually wrote a book against homosexuality. And he was never in his whole lifetime accused of it. And then one person, it was like 30, 40 years later, he said something, and then that's just become the narrative, but when you look at the books that are claiming this, usually it's like, King James, of course he was gay, and so was George Washington, and so was Erasmus, and so was Jesus, and so was David and Jonathan. That's the sort of crowd who are pushing this type of narrative. And so Christians just parrot it. He was gay and he's a pedophile, apparently. It's like they have no understanding of the guy. And so, most of the time, secular historians have gotten a hold of this stuff, trying to spice it all up, and Jesuit information. I mean, this guy, look at the gunpowder plot. They tried to blow up the whole of Parliament. They would have been like 9/11. back in these days. But Guy Fawkes was captured, and so it didn't happen. But they hated him, and so they wanted to slander him. So the thing is, James White is just continuously slandering the King James translators, slandering their work, and he's basically saying they had no communication between each other, which is absolute lie. So let's just continue what he's saying here.
Okay. They didn't work together as a single group. The New Testament was divided up into groups. And so that's why you end up with different translations. So in the Gospels, you shall not murder. In Paul, you shall not kill, or kill and murder. Yeah, it's, the Gospels, you shall not kill. And Romans 13, it's you shall not murder. It's exact same Greek, different translation committees, therefore it comes out differently.
And so what he's doing there is kill and murder back in 1611 were synonyms. It was just word choice. And so there are some Greek words that are translated in 20 different ways. And so, yeah, we have this thing where it's like, if you murder someone, you don't like murder a cow. I know vegans try to make out we're murdering chickens and all that, but it's like murder is usually to do with humans, and to kill something, I killed a cow, or I ran over a dog and killed it. It's usually not, a premeditated, it can be premeditated, but there is a distinction. That's what I'm trying to say, between murder and kill today. But when you read literature back then, they were synonymous. And so James White's trying to make out that this is a huge problem, where clearly in the translators to the reader, they worded things stylistically as well. So when there were two synonymous words, they sometimes use the other depending on how it flowed in the sentence. And so there's nothing wrong with doing that. And so James White's trying to make out that these committees didn't even know what the other ones are doing, and they're translating different words in different places. It's totally anachronistic. He's putting a modern day definition of murder and kill, bringing it back into 1611 and trying to squeeze it into them. There are some words that they were specific on that today we're not even specific on. And so you can have the reverse effect, but there were words back then that were just synonymous, and it didn't matter. It didn't affect anything. It didn't affect the reading, didn't affect anything. And so they just went with the style. And so, anyway, let's let James continue.
And so, at the same time, that means there's differing methodologies that were used in comparing the printed editions from Erasmus and Stephanus and Bazer that they were translating from. They weren't using manuscripts. They were using the Latin Vulgate, and they were using printed editions of the Greek New Testament, but there were different committees, and so they used different standards. And so you've got different standards from Erasmus for each one of his editions, different standards for Stephanus, different standards for Bazer, and he changes over time. And then you have the King James translators using different standards from the printed text to create, eventually, this.
That's where my fallacy meter was just going bing, 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 bing. Like, it's okay, well... So he's basically saying that the King James translators, this is one of the things that he continuously says, they only use the printed editions. They never use manuscripts. Well, how come people like Lancelot Andrews, John Boyce, Henry Saville, Miles Smith, these guys who were legends in those times for their scholarship and recognised by Cambridge and Westminster as being absolute legends, like apart from the King James translation, other translations that they did, or mathematics and things like that, these guys are legends. Yeah, they're like the Einsteins of that era in linguistics, in understanding Greek and Hebrew and Latin, and these guys knew so much. Like Lancelot Andrews spoke 21 languages, 15 European languages, and 6 dead languages. And so, and James White's trying to make out these guys are just slipping on a banana peel, that they never looked at manuscripts. And, Codex Bazer was basically handed to England by Theodore Beza. What, they never went and looked at it? So, no, we can't look at that. We can only look at the editions of Erasmus. and we can only look at the editions of, we can't look at anything else, and it's like, they clearly say in the translators to the reader that they looked at everything. It says that they went through and they went over it and over it and over it and constantly went over the text. And they talk about bringing it back to the anvil and hammering it again, and it didn't tire them to bring it back and do it again. And so they were constantly checking everything. These guys are scholars. They're not like James White, who, it'd take him, a month to just sort of work out one reading, from Erasmus to Stephanus to Bazer, to sort of work that out in printed editions. These guys could read those languages fluently. It's like they were all in English to them. And so they're just reading through it going, okay, that's how he reads it. And they would do that in an afternoon. And then they're just going to, sit around for the rest of the day and do nothing? No, these guys were looking at commentaries. They were looking at ancient writings. And, we're not that far detached from when the age of printing started. So say like Henry Saville, he got 15,000 manuscript sheets of Chrysostom. So he's the early church father, or early church writer, I like to say. And he's gotten 15,000 manuscript sheets. He went all over Europe looking for them. These are manuscripts of early church writers. And so Miles Smith, he's translated the early church writers into English. The work on Chrysostom, that was Henry Saville's, it was in 8 massive volumes. It was the biggest work ever done in England at the time. So him, Lancelot Andrews and John Boyce are all working on this side project while the King James translation's going on. And they're translating all into Greek, from Greek into English. But, they never looked at manuscripts. How dumb is James White? I mean, it just makes me just cringe. Every time he speaks, he says this stuff. So he says, firstly, the King James translators never look at manuscript. They only look at printed editions. So, okay, that's a weird restriction that was put upon them. I don't know where you got that, but, oh well, you're telling the story, dude. And let's not let the truth get away in the way of a good story. And then he's like, okay, and then they're restricted only to Erasmus, Stephanus, and Bazer. It's like, oh, okay, so they couldn't look at the Wolf edition, they couldn't look at the Plantin Polyglot, they couldn't look at the Hutter, they couldn't look at any of those other ones. It's like there was like probably about 100 printed Greek New Testaments up until the King James translators. They would have looked at all of them. It's just, these guys were the top-notch scholars of that era. They've got the king saying, I want this Bible done, I want it done good, work it all out. And these guys had already probably worked most of that stuff out. They're scholars. They're the heads of Cambridge University, Oxford University. These universities aren't renowned for having dimwits and the Three Stooges just sort of, teaching them. This is the top notch. Like even today, people are like, scholars in Oxford and Cambridge University. Oh, brilliant, and they still have this reputation. And so not only can they do that, but then they're in their separate little translational groups, basically around London. And they can't talk to each other, they can't visit each other, they're just sort of stuck, and they have I want to translate it this way, and the other guy translates that way, and then we all put it together at the end, and we can never know. That's not how it happened. And clearly they were talking to each other. They weren't just restricted in their own little group. And even so, you've got 10 guys, scholars, all working on one portion. That should probably be enough. But then they to send it to the other 5 groups. So you got 5 groups of 10 scholars in each scrutinizing your work. And so this is the sort of thing that James White is absolutely illiterate on. And when I say illiterate, it doesn't mean he can't read. When you just don't know something about a subject. He knows nothing about the King James because he doesn't respect it. He doesn't respect Erasmus, doesn't respect Bazer, doesn't respect Stephanus. He doesn't respect the King James translators or the version. He just like wipes it off and he's just like, oh. And whatever he can find to smear or just create misinformation, he will just run with that. And so then, after they're only limited to no manuscripts, only the Erasmus and Stephanus and Bazer editions, and, a few other English ones like the Geneva and the other ones. And then, we're all in these separate groups, and, even though there's roughly about 60 of us, we can't work together. We can't, we can't know what the other guys are doing, and then it's just all fudged together. And then Scrivener, 250 years later, does a Greek edition, a back translation of the King James. It's like just all these little stories that he said over the years, that he just compiles them all together just to create this narrative. And it's like, if you seriously, even if you just look on Wikipedia, for crying out loud, you can easily disprove all this. There's enough information just in the Encyclopedia Britannica to just show James White is just a bumbling idiot here. And it's like, only someone who has a barrow to push would push like James White is right now. He has a barrow to push. His best-selling book, The King James Only Controversy, he wants you to know about it. He wants you to go and buy it so you can try and prove him wrong, or, so you can, teach your church about the real word of God and defend the NIV and all this. He has no interest in truth. He is pushing an agenda. And so, and to him, it's about sales. And so it's unfortunate to watch, but, we see it in other wolves. Benny Hinn, he'll do anything for a sale, or, John MacArthur. These guys, they'll, rant off stuff, and, you can take the mark of the beast and all this sort of stuff. And, it's sad to watch that people will go this direction, but I think James White has been headed in this direction. I don't think he's changed since he started. He wants to get popular, and he wants to sell books, and he will do anything to push his barrow. Because I know that he's not interested in truth, because there have been gems of truth that have been presented to him, and he just, casting pearls before swine comes to mind. He just throws them in the mud, tramples them, and then turns and rends you. And so, anyway, I'll let James continue.
That's why there is no one method that will ever come up with this. That's why you have to use one argument for Revelation 16:5, a different argument for Revelation 14:1, a different argument for Ephesians chapter 3, a different argument for Matthew chapter 1. You have to use a different argument, and that's why your system is absolutely indefensible.
Well, we use a different argument because there's different evidence. Like, say, for Revelation 16:5, there's only 4 manuscripts before the 10th century. So, of course, we're going to look at the early church writings. We're going to look at different versions, a Latin version. We're going to look at commentaries and things like that. And so when you look at all that, you can see that this reading is everywhere. If we've only got 4 Greek manuscripts before the 10th century, obviously we're going to do that. Now, if you've got 500 Greek manuscripts before the 10th century, you can look at those. And so he's trying to make out we have to, like rubber stamp, we have to do the same methodology for Revelation 16:5, and we have to do the same for this reading, and for 1 John 5:7, and we have to do, it's like, no, you work with the evidence that you have. You become pliable to what you're presented with. You don't use the same methodology for everything. Not even the critical text guys do this. It's just ridiculous. And so, there are some readings that aren't contested at all in the critical text or in the TR. They're in total agreement. And there's just no variant. So, what do you do there? And some of them have one variant. Say there might be a manuscript that says, instead of 666, it says 616. There's a tiny, 0.011, there's a tiny handful of manuscripts. I think it's like 2 or 3 manuscripts that have 616, and people have recognized that as a corruption because, that somehow added up to Nero or whatever. And it's a perversion, it's a corruption, and you've got to treat that information differently to say the last 12 verses of Mark, where there's 1,700 manuscripts that have it, there's only 2 that don't. And so you've got to weigh that up. And so when there's the majority of manuscripts have it, and there's 2 that differ, And people are saying, oh, well, yeah, obviously 666, and these other ones deviate from that. But then when you've got, the last 12, that's not just one numeral, 616 or 666. We're talking about 12 verses deleted. That's what James White wants to do. He places doubt on 254 verses of the Bible. And so he's chopping the Bible up like like someone making sushi. And his Bible is filled with holes. Many times you'll just go to a scripture and he's already done a thing on it, and it shouldn't be the way that you've read it for the last 20 years. And so, anyway, we'll let him continue to talk, because hopefully I can finish this today.
It's indefensible. That's all there is to it. You need to abandon it, because it's indefensible. That's
indefensible according to his straw man argument. The TR is very defensible. There was no other Bible for that 300 years during that time. It was the TR. That's why they called it the received text. Even he contradicts himself. He's like, oh, it was just some advertising blurb in the Elzevirs, 1633. It said, this is the received text that we've all received, and received by who? It's like, well, received by everyone. It was like basically the only printed text from, Complutense and Polyglot all the way up until Luckman. So where's the rival Greek text? It's not even in existence until, Luckman, and then Westcott and Hort had this Frankenstein text that they made, and then it's like, oh, that's the real one. So, well, where's this been for the last few hundred years? Have we had a text? It's like, oh, well, it's corrupt. It's just throw it out. And it's like, his methodology is inconsistent. His methodology is more like what the cults say. So Jehovah's Witnesses say, well, true Christianity died out in the 1st century, and then all of a sudden in 1850s, it sparked up again, and now we've got Jehovah's Witnesses, and all this stuff. And so James White's sort of pretty much saying the same, the true text sort of died out, and then we've got this revival of the text again. And all in between, they had these horrible, wicked texts, Text Receptus and these other texts and Byzantine texts, and just filled with rubbish. Just all these extra pieces. It's like having a 1,000-piece puzzle with 100 extra pieces. It's like, we've got to get rid of them. And they're all the verses that he wants to chop out. And it's like, so you're saying that we didn't have a Bible for how long? 1,500 years or 1,800 years? It's like, and this is the amazing position that these guys have. And so obviously with that type of position, he has to make up stuff about us, that our position is undefensible and contradictory and all this. I mean, which position would you have? That, the Reformation guys, Martin Luther, Tyndale, Calvin, all the way through the revival in England, revival in Germany, all the way through up until, that the King James, everything like that, an Italian Bible, Spanish Bible, all based upon the Text Receptus. That was all just a corrupt manuscript. And his new one by Westcott and Hort and George Van Smith, who was a Unitarian, a bit like a Jehovah's Witness, didn't believe in the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. They've created this new text that we should read. And then that's sort of come through Nessel, and now it's Carlo Martini, who was in line to be a pope. Him and Bruce Metzger, liberal Bruce Metzger, who's student Bart Ehrman. He's sort of famous for him, and Kurt Aland and these other heretics. I believe they're heretics. Whose story are you going to believe? That we've always had the text there, or that it's just disappeared. And so, anyway.
Well, I said this stuff is bad for apologetics, because the people on the other side out there are just as smart as we are, and sometimes more. So if it's an indefensible argument, don't adopt it.
So basically what he's saying, it's a bit like if I was debating against a Jehovah's Witness and they had certain conclusions that they wouldn't turn from, and I just sort of agree with them. It's like, oh yeah, the Trinity was invented at the Council of Nicaea or something dumb like that. I just go, well, You should just agree with it, because then you can debate them. That's not, I think the Textus Receptus position is way more defensible and has way more bullets than the critical text. Just because the Roman Catholic Church uses the critical text, just because Bart Ehrman respects the critical text, just because, other cults, they're, gravitating towards this text, and say, if he's debating against a Muslim and the Muslim says, well, there's only this much evidence for this reading or whatever, he just goes, yeah, I agree with you. That's why I have a critical text reading. So he's actually not even fighting there. He's just agreeing with them. He's laying down with them. And he thinks that is doing good apologetics. And so what he's saying is, you can't debate these guys because your information is flawed. My information is good, and so I can debate these guys. But he doesn't. These guys use his information to mock him, because he's basically saying, this reading that's been, attested to, like, say, the last 12 verses of Mark. There's only 2 manuscripts that don't have it. There's 1,700 Greek manuscripts that do. It's pretty much everywhere. It's like, but no, James White is going to go with the 2 that don't have it. And what he thinks that he's going to stand in front of, Roman Catholic or a Muslim or whoever would find that, a hole in that argument. Well, he thinks it's more defensible. He actually, say God was manifest in the flesh. There's 1 Timothy 3:16. He actually says that that's the better reading. But then he goes around the world saying the opposite, because he actually goes against his own conscience a lot of the time for promotion of the book, and because the modern Bibles say it. And so he's not going to go around. He says it in his book, but he doesn't go around saying, hey, I think this is the better reading. No, he basically just shuts his mouth about it, and then he says, it's not a conspiracy theory of how they came up with the reading, who appeared in a body, who didn't appear in a body. What's so good about that? Great is the mystery of godliness, who appeared in a body. What's so special about that? I've appeared in a body, so has he. God was manifest in the flesh. That's why it's great is the mystery of godliness. Without controversy, it's a huge thing. And also it creates the greatest grammatical blunder in the whole entire critical text, with a predicate without a subject. That's why they said it's a song, that Paul was saying, great is the mystery of godliness, and he broke out into a song, who was manifest in the flesh, because the grammar changes so much there, it's so abrupt that it's just like, hang on, this is an error, but it's like, no, it's a song. So what proof do you have it's a song? Well, Westcott and Hort, they come up with some pretty cool ideas to smooth over ridiculous, retarded, rubbish readings like that. It's that. How else can you explain the greatest grammatical blunder in their whole critical text? But James White believes the Textus Receptus reading there, but he doesn't go around promoting it. It's just like, and this guy wants us to trust him as, our position's indefensible. Even when Stephen Anderson pinpointed him on that, he wriggled out of that like a worm, and it's just ridiculous. This guy is a joke. So anyway, we'll let him continue. He's still got about 25 minutes left, or 15 minutes left, sorry.
Okay, and this is why. So Erasmus has his own thing. Erasmus, for example, really dislikes the concept of predestination. But Bazer likes the concept of predestination. And that's going to impact their choices. And so as the King James translators then are looking at, well, Bazer has this and Erasmus has this, you're going to have differing sources there and differing biases involved. Oh no, what do we do? Well, that's why you need to have committee-done translations, and that's why you need to...
So here he's saying, Erasmus on the issue of predestination and Bazer, they might be in disagreement. But when you look at the King James translators, there was a mix. So there were what would be, later, labelled as Calvinists after the Synod of Dort and, Reformed. But there were people who weren't. And so... there was a mixture, and basically White saying, that would cause a problem. But how come he can't see that Westcott and Hort, having a Unitarian with them who doesn't believe in the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, at least Erasmus believed in the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, Stephanus, Bazer, the King James guys, all believe that. It's like from the beginning, Westcott and Hort guys are like, oh, let's get a Unitarian on board. And he wrote a book saying now he can easily refute a lot of doctrines because we've deleted them from the Greek text. And he worked with them. They say, oh, no doctrine's affected. The guy who worked with Westcott and Hort is saying doctrine's affected. Why lie? Just be honest about it, But then Carlo Martini, so you got, Anglican, liberal Anglicans, but they wrote, dissertations about the resurrection of Jesus. It's like, man, look at their lives. Look at what's coming out of their mouth. Look at what they're doing. Look at who they're hanging around. Unitarians, defending Unitarians. Then you got Unitarian George Van Smith there. Then you got Nessel, and then you've got these Roman Catholic, a guy in line to be a pope. And he's trying to make out there's this huge difference between, predestination and other thoughts, when it's like, okay, even just the difference between Unitarianism and Roman Catholicism is just so far away. And then you got Trinitarians working there, but then you got liberals like Bruce Metzger, and it's like, and he's trying to pick on us. Sorry, dude. It's like trying to make out that this is a huge deal among the Textus Receptus guys. It's like, man, I mean, talk about comparing chalk and cheese. You just had this mess of Catholics and liberals and Unitarians and just this mess. Tischendorf, and you haven't even gone into these other guys. And it's like, the main guys, Erasmus, what he brought out his text a year before Martin Luther basically sparked a Reformation. So it was even, years later before all that sort of started to just balance itself out. And he's just going to join it like this? No, he's like, hang on, let's think about these things, let's work these things through and all the rest of it. But even in Spain, reformers were called Erasmists after Erasmus. The reformers were called that because he was known. He was one of the most critical guys against the Roman Catholic Church. That's why all of his books were put on the forbidden list, because it was a time when the Roman Catholic scholars, they had a lot of freedom up until Martin Luther did what he did. And they're like, okay, shut it all down. We were starting to collapse here. And then they put all these books on the forbidden list, and they're like, man, these guys they're not really supportive of the Pope. But he wrote books about the Pope going to hell. It's like, yeah, just a faithful Roman Catholic there, James. As if. Anyway, I'll continue.
Have as much information as possible, and you need to have an overarching committee that looks at what the various committees have done. And that's why you have to have a agreed upon methodology of doing textual criticism. Now,
what the King James guys didn't have that. They actually had, I explained how they did the translation, but they actually had an overarching committee that went over the whole thing at the end. And so there was a handful of guys chosen, the top-notch scholars, and they were chosen to go over the whole thing to look at those issues of harmonization and everything like that. So James White doesn't know. He either doesn't know this or he's lying. I think he just doesn't know, because he's just he's just slandering. He's like, King James is just, he believes that King James is the dumbest thing ever. But these guys, they're not silly. They understand that most people think the King James is great. So they'll say, I love the King James. I read the King James, and, it's full of prose and full of lovely words, and, it's just so lovely. Usually when I hear people start saying that, straight away they'll praise the King James, and then you fast forward and they're just saying, yeah, but the King James is so dumb here and has this error in it, and it has it, you're just like, well, you actually don't really praise it, It's like, just come out and be honest. And so I think the King James is stupid. And so this is one of the things that he really needs to do, is just come out and say Textus Receptus is dumb, King James is just retarded. But see, the thing is, he's trying to remain neutral. Like, you can read the King James, and That's fine, but you're just a bit of a dimwit if you do. That's what he's trying to put into your head. And so a lot of people are influenced by him, and a lot of people will jump online and say, oh, I used to read the King James or TR-based Bibles until I read James White's book, and that's why I do these videos, so people can get information. And obviously, I'm not sure how long I've gone for yet, probably a couple of hours, but it's like, man, James White is such a liar and such a slanderer. He's just bringing up a few little issues, and you have to stop every 1 minute and just explain and say, man, don't trust him on this. Don't listen to him on this. He's lying. Look at just go online and type in things and look at other information, because, just because he's popular doesn't mean he's right.
I know people will argue. I know that you can argue that even today, the guys at Munster that are working on ECM are not absolutely consistent in their application of their stated principles. I agree. But they're trying to be. There wasn't even an attempt in the production of the TR. It couldn't have been. It was before the ability to collate manuscripts.
Before the ability to collate manuscripts? What is he smoking? Basically, to collate a manuscript, what you do, you basically, have your, text on one side, and you have a basic, sort of, you might work on, say, the text receptors, 1598 of Bazer or the 1550 of Stephanus. But you check your manuscript against the printed edition, and so that's collating a manuscript, or you can collate a manuscript against another manuscript. And so collation is going through and examining how large the letters were, if it was messy, if it were what color the ink was, and whether there's damage done to the manuscript. And you're looking at all sorts of different things. You're looking at whether the writing style changed halfway through, so they got another scribe in, or all those sorts of things. Collation. So Erasmus didn't collate manuscripts. James White doesn't know anything. Erasmus was an Augustinian monk, so that's exactly what Martin Luther was. These guys were scribes. Erasmus wrote Latin manuscripts. He copied Latin manuscripts. That's how he knew so much about manuscripts, because when he was younger, he was doing copying of these manuscripts. That's how he becomes so interested in, hang on, what about this reading and that reading? And after working on his Latin translation and looking at Greek and Latin proverbs, he printed 5,000 of them. He became interested in the Greek text because of Lorenzo Valla. He's a very famous Renaissance guy. And he knew all about manuscripts. He was an expert at manuscripts. Like seriously, if you got Erasmus and brought him into Munster today, they would just be bowing down. Even the people in Munster would say, yeah, Erasmus knew his stuff, man. Like, he knew way, 100 times more than we do today. Because it wasn't just on a computer somewhere. It's like, I've got access to Google, so I've got all this stuff. No, he knew this stuff. He printed so many books. He was going through reprinting stuff like Lorenzo Valla's stuff. He was writing out the whole manuscript of Reuchling's. And this guy knew what he was doing. And to say Stephanus, Stephanus was one of the best printers in the whole of Europe at this time. And so, 1550, he's done his edition. And so he was basically the printer for the royal printer in Paris. And so his son, Henry Stephanus, he continued the work and ended up working basically for Bazer. And they printed a whole bunch of other books. They used to print books like grammatical books, books on the early church writers, just tons of material. Where are they getting that? From manuscripts. These are printing has just boomed. And so these guys, the Aldine guys, the guys at Basel, the guys Stephanus, and clearly he said, I looked at this manuscript, and he lists like, was it 19 manuscripts that he looked at, or 16? I think it was 19. What, they never went to manuscripts? How dumb is James White to say that? This is one of the main things about the 1550 that James White owns. He owns a copy. It's like worth $10,000. He knows nothing about it. And then you look at Theodore Bazer. Codex Bazer, which is a 5th century manuscript, is named after him because he owned it. Well, they never went to manuscripts, What is he waffling on about? Anyway, let's just continue. I could just spend half an hour on that. There's just so much error that this guy is just spewing forth. And to me, it just shows signs of unregeneracy, a dead religious spirit, trying to attack the words of God.
Sense of even knowing which manuscripts are which. One of the fascinating things is Kranz addresses the question in Stephanus, the 1550 text. Stephanus has a small number of manuscripts that he cites, and he only cites them in certain texts. It is not a complete collation at all. But his beta, his B text, we now know was Codex Bazer Cantabrigiensis, which was given to Beza. That's why it's called Bazer Cantabrigiensis. 05 is the number we've assigned to it today. It's the Living Bible of the Ancient Church. It's wacky, it's wild, it's crazy. But that's Stephanus' B. But Beza didn't seem to know that was B. So there were times when he's using Stephanus, which was years before him, and now he has that manuscript, but doesn't know that Stephanus had that manuscript, and so he gives it double weight in certain readings. See, we don't have that problem today because we have...
See, this is where he needs to say, okay, this Kranz says it here, it's documented, because is James White just making this up like he's done with many other things? Does Kranz say it? Can we evaluate Kranz's word? And so I'm going to have to go through Kranz, read a whole bunch of stuff and find it. And oftentimes, even with Kranz, it's just like with Bruce Metzger. They question things. It's not like, okay, this is a statement. They're just like, oh, well, could it possibly be that this, that Erasmus was, had a bad hair day and slipped on a banana peel, that they make out that these guys were just the Three Stooges. And so they're constantly just questioning things. And so this is what Bruce Metzger is famous for just questioning over and over, and until scholars just think that that's something that Bruce Metzger knew about. But when the acid's poured on, he admits, "Oh no, it's just speculation." I clearly make it a question. I don't say that's exactly what happened, but he doesn't say it's not what happened either. Many times you're just left there like with this conclusion, and so this is what James White's doing. And who knows? Perhaps he's just reading young Kranz's book, and that's his conclusion. But we really need references and to look into all that. So it's just another smear. What he's basically saying is the 1550, 1551 edition. So basically, the difference between the 1550 and 1551 of Stephanus is just the 1551 was the first one with numbering system. That's why we have John 3:16, because he put numbers to everything. He actually put numbers to all literature. So when you basically, even if you read through Shakespeare, it's like, okay, line number 10, that was all numbered. Basically in 1550, his text didn't have numbers. 1551 it did, and they went on to number pretty much everything. So that way you could say, okay, this verse, this chapter, and it just made everything so much easier. So this was Stephanus who basically invented that. Brilliant. It's like, but no, he's one of the Three Stooges, apparently, according to James White. And so what you've got is Theodore Bazer, who came after him. He's doing his editions, and he's going, oh, well, Stephanus said this reading here, but I keep forgetting what he's talking about. And so you just imagine this this guy, this Swiss French reformer just going, I don't know what he's saying. I think he's talking about one manuscript, but he's talking about another. Is that Codex D or is that some other one? I don't know. I think there's two there. Yeah, that's basically what he's saying, that the guy was just that dumb. He didn't realise, with the manuscript that he had on him, named after him, Codex Bazer, he had it sitting in front of him. So instead of checking that, he's like, oh, okay, Stephanus said this, and just because a lot of people don't know how to read Stephanus's list of manuscripts and line them up with manuscripts that we have today, Bazer would have been able to do that. His son, Stephanus's son, Henry Stephanus, was his printer. These guys knew their stuff. They were working together, and it's just another story that's just undocumented, that is just slander, and it's just yet another one. So James White is just so desperate. He's just throwing this stuff in the air, like, he didn't even know which manuscript he was reading, and it's unfounded, just trash. And I've found since he's gotten, basically since he started reading this Book of Crowns, he told me to read it, 3 years ago now, and he hadn't even read it himself. I mean, what sort of apologist is he? But he's just repeating all this stuff, and who knows if it's true or not. I've already shown and demonstrated how there's biased translations in the work of Crowns, and so he can't be trusted.
Cataloging system, and we have high quality digital photography, and we can compare these things. We know which one's which. And
so Theodore Bezer, having the actual manuscript there in front of him, named after him, Codex Bazer, Canterbury-Gensis, he couldn't figure out what Stephanus was talking about, because he had the manuscript as well. So he had no idea. So now with digital photography and everything, we can figure this stuff out. It's like, man, he's got the thing in front of him. And the thing is, it's probably in way better condition back then than it is now, because there's wear and tear, and you got 450 years of wear and tear there. And so, what is James White going on about? More slander, more anecdotes. Erasmus, Stephanus, and Beza are the three stooges, and the King James translators are just the comedy company. And so they're just a bunch of dim-witted losers who just kept getting it wrong. And today we just have such better scholarship. What a joke. What an absolute joke. I mean, these guys back then, even 100 years ago, the scholarship back then was just so much more superior than what we have today. And I understand we have different technology, and there are lots of smart people around. I'm not saying that, but I'm saying as a whole, standards of, to get into university and things like that, you used to have to speak Latin fluently and Greek fluently and things like that to get certain positions. And, people who basically became ordained, they usually spoke Greek and Latin, and sometimes Hebrew. They knew Hebrew, could read it. And it's like, those sort of standards. Now it's like, I own a Bible, a Strong's Concordance, and it's, you don't need hardly any qualifications. And so I'm not saying that you need all that, but what I'm saying is the level of scholarship has just dropped since this era. This is the peak of scholarship. This is just after the Renaissance, just after the Reformation, or the third and fourth generation reformers, and it's like, man, this is like a pinnacle. And you got Shakespeare. English is at its peak. The King James translators. And it's like, he's just trying to make out that these guys are, wish they were here today with all the stuff that we have. It's like, I'm sure that they would jump on these websites and go, yeah, you've got a whole bunch of manuscripts, but you're actually missing this one and that one, and we were using this Latin one and this Syriac one. And where are all they? Because they would have had a lot more than they're mentioned. There's lots of things that would have gone missing in time.
So on and so forth, but that wasn't a luxury that they had. So when you want to put forward a text created by that process, that's your problem. It's not ours. That's your problem. So anyway, Matthew 1:23. What is interesting is to look at they shall call his name Emmanuel, because in the Hebrew it's you shall call. You shall call, not they shall call. So there is a difference between the Septuagint and the Hebrew. Now, what's interesting, and I told you there's some cool background stuff here. Even if you're not necessarily into textual criticism, there's some other stuff here it's worthwhile learning. What's interesting is you don't have this with Erasmus, but by the time you get to Bazer, you are seeing the formulation and foundation of what we would call Reformed Orthodoxy. Bazer is important in that. He's a huge step in the codification, filling out the teachings and the positions of his mentor, John Calvin. And that impacts how Bazer does textual criticism. So one of the ways that it impacts how he does textual criticism is in light of the argument with Rome now, the supremacy of the Hebrew truth, the Hebrew text, is being held to by the Reformed over against any differences with the Greek Septuagint, which is problematic because the New Testament writers quote the Septuagint. And so Bazer, for example, one of the things that Bazer does over and over.
Okay, so just quickly. So basically what James White's saying is, there was a battle with the Roman Catholics, and because Theodore Bazer was instrumental in sort of, creating the, Reformed thing and, taking over from John Calvin, that, this affected things. But at the end of the day, the arguments that they have with Roman Catholicism, he's trying to make out that this caused them to get a reading from the Greek Septuagint. And then just one thing that James White says there is because the early church used the Greek Septuagint. Now, this is just another one of those ridiculous concepts that here's a whole bunch of Hebrew guys. And, they're reading the Hebrew Bible. Jesus stood up and reads, Isaiah and all that. But apparently Jesus quoted a Greek Bible to his disciples. It's like, okay, instead of speaking Aramaic and reading the Hebrew, they just, went for this Greek. And so let me just put this to you, and this is from... I've believed this for maybe 20 years now, and I can't see any evidence that can sway me from this, Now, I believe the Bible was translated into other languages, portions of it, perhaps even a wholesale Old Testament. I don't know. You don't know. We don't have any evidence for that, okay? What we have is a few Greek scraps that are claimed to be BC. Perhaps they are, perhaps they aren't. I've got no problem with them being BC, that's fine. But what they say is, okay, the whole Bible, the first 5 books of Moses were done. That's the original story of the Septuagint. But then they've got the whole Old Testament done. And this was used by all the disciples, and Jesus used it and all this. And so, to me, the whole concept of Jesus, Hebrew guy, just quoting Greek, and, especially with the Hellenists, they're not really favored. And it's like, to a bunch of Hebrew guys, it doesn't make any sense. And so, and also to think that what they had then is exactly the same Septuagint that we can just look up today. It's just, it's word for word. That's exactly what we got. And to me, we're even looking at, in the Byzantine and text receptors, things had to be cleaned up. Everywhere there was manuscript tradition, things had to be cleaned up. And so it makes more sense to me that early church, they were all Hebrew, okay? up until Cornelius. And so they were using the Hebrew scriptures. Now, there were a bunch of Greek women people who were Hellenized and people who were looked after by people like Stephen and others who perhaps they spoke Greek. And so we see at the day of Pentecost, there was, I think it was 15 different languages there. And so obviously Jews had gone out into the world, they'd spoke different languages, and they were coming back saying, well, you're speaking the language we use back over in Libya and over in Arabia and all these other places. And so there's no doubt that people would have spoken languages and people would have gone, okay, I can translate this into this language for my people or whatever. But primarily, the church that's in Jerusalem, they're going to be speaking Hebrew or basically Aramaic, and they're going to be reading the Hebrew. And so then comes, Cornelius's household, and then comes the explosion of going to the Gentiles. And so Paul's instrumental in this, and Gentiles hear the word of God, and specifically around Greece. And thanks to Alexander the Great, most of the world spoke Greek, and so they were writing to the church at Ephesus and Thessaloniki, and they weren't writing these in Hebrew. They would have written them in Greek because the audience was Greek, So, and even when Jesus died on the cross, there was Hebrew, there was Latin, and there was Greek. So these, obviously the Hebrew was for that region. But to speak Latin, the Roman Empire was ruling, so it's like you got to speak Latin to talk to the soldiers and tell them that you're a good guy. And the Greek was well known too. That was well known in trade and all the rest of it. And so what we have is people, they get the New Testament in Greek because that was just the common language. And we see that Jerusalem was basically destroyed in 70 AD. And so people were writing things. And so whether or not things were written exactly, perhaps someone did write something in Hebrew and translate it or whatever. I don't agree with it. I think everything was written in Greek originally. But then basically because of the Gentiles, this message is going to the Gentiles. The Jewish people tended to be rejecting this message and pushing against it. So there's just this fertile field in the Greek-speaking world in Asia Minor. So it's like, let's just go there. Let's work things out with them. And so they're doing New Testaments. And then after a while, they're like, what's this quotation from? And who's Isaiah? And they're like, okay, well, we'll have to do an Old Testament. So people started doing Old Testament editions of the Greek. And so this is after Jesus. This is around the time of the apostles or whatever. So they're doing Greek Old Testaments. And then eventually it gets to Origen and his hexapla, which is basically 6 columns. And the 5th column is a Greek one. So that's where the Septuagint came from. Not, Jesus used it and all that. It came more so from after Jesus and, probably after the time of the disciples, because the Greek-speaking church were like, well, we want this. So like any church, you imagine if you're doing a Greek Old Testament, you've got your New Testament there and you love it, and you're reading the Old Testament, you're like, wow, or you're writing the Old Testament, you're translating the Old Testament, you're like, wow, I can actually get this verse directly from our Greek New Testament and copy it and paste it straight into the Old there. Because, Isaiah, he's talking about this, and in Genesis, it's talking about, leaning on the staff of the bed and this and that. And so they started copying and pasting things from the New Testament into the Old. Now, how do we know they did that? Because sometimes they copied and pasted it into the wrong place where there was similar wording at the beginning, but it's nothing to do with the story. And so, say, for example, in Genesis chapter 48 and 50, there's different accounts of Joseph dying and Jacob dying. And so people can get mixed up, and especially if you don't know the Old Testament that well, you're copying and pasting things into the wrong spot. And then what happens is people in the future, they look at these Greek ones and go, wow, it lines up with the New Testament so well. Maybe this is the Greek that Jesus quoted from or Paul quoted from. It's like, no, that's years later they copy and pasted it over the top of it. So to me, that makes way more sense. Now, I've had to just explain that to you. It's taken me maybe 10 minutes just to say that one little comment that James White said, the early church used the Septuagint, it's unproven. It hasn't been. If they have the manuscripts to show that that's what happened, sure, I'll believe it. But they don't. And so, but what we do see is things have been copied and pasted even into the wrong place, and so that we know that that's what scholars were doing. So to me, that makes way more sense than Jesus was using a faulty. And because the Septuagint today is all corrupted and all over the place, they say, well, that's exactly what they had back then. They had a corrupt Bible, so it's okay to use the NIV even if it's corrupt. That's their logic. It's like, no, they spoke Hebrew, they used Hebrew. Greek church came, they did New Testament, and then the Greek guys did the Old. And if you follow the Greek church, they became pretty prideful about, wow, God's chosen the Greek language to use, and it sort of became like the Septuagint is the Bible, and it's like, just like the Roman Catholics, like the Latin is, that's it, it's just this sort of prideful spirit. And a lot of people like to sort of put the King James thing in there, with the importance of the King James and everything like that, and say, oh, it's exactly the same sort of spirit. You just say, oh, it's the Bible because it's in English, and I wouldn't care if they'd done what they did in German. I would say that German Bible is the most accurate, but they just so happens to be in English. It just so happens that half the world speak English. So it's like, it's not, I'm not an Anglophile. I'm not like, okay. And I think that's actually, because that has happened in the past, people actually overreact to the King James and say, oh, no, it couldn't be any good readings in the King James. That's like King James only sort of stuff. And, saying that the English is of importance. It's just gutter language, it's just trash. And it's like, no, God used the gutter language of Greek and of Latin, and he can use English as well. And so God can use these things to carry his word into the future. Okay, we've got about 12 minutes to go.
And this, again, is so contrary to the argumentation of the TR guys today. Is Bazer's comments are filled with his saying, well, this reading probably was a marginal gloss that was brought into the text. Dozens of times, Bazer will say this, even if we don't have any evidence of it. He will look to harmonize text based upon the conjecture of a marginal gloss. And when we get to this, he simply doesn't like the idea that Matthew could write, they will call his name Emmanuel, rather than you will call his name Emmanuel. And so he says that this should be changed to the second person singular, kalesais, from kalesusin, or kalesusi in the TR that didn't include the movable nu. So Kron says, this incongruity is more than Bazer is willing to accept. He adopts kalesais, translated as vocabis, already in 1556. In 1556, he justifies this editorial intervention as follows. I know that in most copies, kai kalesusi is read, that is, and they will call, and he, Jesus, will be called, which reading was also followed by Justin Martyr. But as our Stephanus noted, that some old copies agree with the Hebrew, and as great force would seem to lie in this apostrophe by the prophet, seized by God's Spirit, in which he addresses himself to the Virgin, who would be born so many centuries later as if she were present, I have followed my own judgment in this matter, without, in my opinion, any damage to the meaning. From Stephanus' edition, Bazer could only know that kalesais is the reading in Stephanus' second manuscript. That is, Codex Bazer. This is one of those situations where Bazer himself did not realize that Stephanus, his second manuscript, had now been given to Bazer. And so he's thinking that this is two texts that have the same reading.
So Stephanus has this text. It ends up in Bazer's lap. And when Bezer's reading the text to Stephanus, he can't figure out what marginal notes or anything are to do with Codex Bazer. So if he couldn't figure it out, who could? I mean, he's the guy taken over from him. He was even using his text as the whole basis, but didn't know anything about it. It's just so dumb. Like, it's just like, I'm sorry, but what can I say? What can I say? It's what example can I use that he would just say this? Now, just to keep you up to speed, because he did talk about a lot of things. So he basically said, and this is a translation, you've got to understand, from Jan Kranz. Now, we understand Jan Kranz translates things with a bias. We've seen that. Erica Rummel is a little bit more understanding or a little bit more truthful, where Jan Kranz is trying to make out that there's all sorts of weird things, and basically that's where James White gets his understanding that Erasmus doesn't think the book of Revelation is canonical. Erica Rummel said the Greeks once doubted the text, which is true. History knows that, but it was changed to Erasmus now doubts the text. It's like, hang on, it doesn't say that. And so I've shown James White these two places where there's a disagreement in how the Latin is translated. And like I've said before, just like Nostradamus's books are hardly, there's hardly much prophecy in it at all, but it's the way that it's interpreted and brought over. So if you're very poor at translating Latin, or you've got a bias and you've got a book to sell, you can just write, well, this is what he really meant. And so Nostradamus's books over the years have been just thoroughly discredited by people who can actually read the Latin. And so here we've got to be careful, because we know Jan Kranz translates with a bias. So I'm reading his translation here. So what I'm going to have to do is go through and just make sure that this is what he translated. So this is where, if anyone wants to help me, we have mountains of Latin manuscripts that are being brought up in arguments like this, and it's like, oh, this is what he's saying. And then when you look through it, it's like, no, that's not what he's saying at all. And so these scholars are lying to us. And so, but I'm going to read through, and I'm just going to give him the benefit of the doubt in this case, but later on I'm going to scrutinize this. So basically, Theodore Bezer said in his 1556 Latin, so he did a Latin Bible, and then he went on to do the 1565 Greek, and he did a whole bunch of stuff after that. So he wrote, I know that in most copies, Kai Kalusi is read, that is, and they will call, and he, in brackets, Jesus, will be called, which reading was also followed by Justin Martyr. But as our Stephanus noted, that some old copies agree with the Hebrew, and as great force would seem to lie in this apostrophe by the prophet, seized by God's Spirit, in which he addresses himself to the Virgin, who would be born so many centuries later as if she were present, I have followed my own judgment on this matter without, in my opinion, any damage to the reading. So this is where James White will read into this and like, see, he's just following his own judgment on the matter. And so this is one of the problems. You don't know the context of, what's said, and even in the middle of it, there's just ... So they've left out bits, and sometimes they're important bits. And James White will read into that, he's just following his own opinion. And this is what he was trying to make out with Bazer, with Revelation 16:5, that I just sort of made up the thing because it sounds poetic. And it's not what Bazer said at all. So we know that James White has lied about Revelation 16:5, about what Theodore Bazer said. Theodore Bazer clearly said that it was to do with the sacred name of God. And he said to read Revelation chapter 1, verse 4. And so when you read through that, he talks about nomina sacra. He talks about the sacred name of Jehovah and I am, and how this is expanded in the one who was and is and shall be. And that's the reading of Revelation 16:5. And so he clearly has this. But James White doesn't want to deal with any of that. He's got his way of reading, and he's looking for these little sound bites and going, hang on, he's followed his own judgment on the matter. Now, is that just the way that Kranz is bringing the Latin across? Most probably. That's where I would go. But then it says, okay, in his 1582 New Testament, Bazer has, and it's translated as, this is Kranz's translation again, but it is preferable to follow the received reading, so that it is an apostrophe by the prophet seized by God's Spirit, in which he addresses himself to the Virgin, who would be born so many centuries later, as if she were present with, which has great force. So he focuses in on, instead of his own opinion, then it's the received reading. Okay, but the thing was, if Theodore Bazer has written this firstly in 1556 in Latin, okay, and then he's doing a Greek Latin parallel Bible with the Latin Vulgate on the side, so it's got 3 columns. The received text, the text that was received 3 years before this, was the Latin that they'd done, which was done by Tremellius, Janius, and Bazer, and that became the standard Latin for 300 years. So that's a received text. When you look at the Hebrew that was being done by Tremellius, that was a received Hebrew text. James White's just sort of saying, he said the received text and just jumping on this word, but it had become received. It's like that became the reading. People were moving away from in these tiny little differences, moving away from what Stephanus has said and adopting Bezer's reading. Just like in Revelation 16:5, Hosios, Esomenos became accepted. And even in the Elzevas, their first edition, they followed Stephanus, but then they came around. And then in 1633, they had the same reading as Bezer. And so Bezer's reading became standard. And so in many, many places. And so what's wrong with him saying the received text, the received reading? It's just like, because this is one of their arguments against the text receptus. Received by who? It's like, by everyone? But then here it's like, he's written not in my own opinion, so, but that can mean anything, and that's been translated from the Latin. How are we sure that that's exactly what's meant? And then it's changed to, instead of his opinion, it's changed to follow the received reading. Well, even if it was his own opinion in the beginning, and he's run with it, and it's like, well, that's become the received reading. I mean, Revelation 16:5 was his own opinion that it was nomina sacra, and all the evidence pointed towards that. And so I just, basically James White is making a mountain out of a molehill here. And so, but we'll let him continue. Where is he?
It's only one. It is not likely that Henri's collations, Stephanus' son, did further collations that Beza had access to, contain further attestations for this reading. In 1582, a remarkable change takes place. Beza still points out that Kalasusi is the best attested reading, both in Greek manuscripts and patristic sources, but now he drops the reference to following his own judgment and writes as follows. Now listen to this, folks. This is important. But it is preferable to follow the received reading. Let me read that again. But it is preferable to follow the received reading, so that it is an apostrophe of the prophet seized by God's Spirit, in which he addresses himself to the virgin who would be born so many centuries later as if she were present, which has great force. With the received reading, Bazer obviously intends kolesais, his conjecture, based upon his understanding of the Hebrew. This change in Bazer's annotation was commented on very critically already by Wettstein.
Now, that's very important. If you want to know where Jan Kranz gets a lot of his misinformation from, or just dirt to throw up in Erasmus's phrase, he gets it from Wettstein. But the thing is, too, it's how he interprets Wettstein. So I've copied Wettstein's position here in Matthew chapter 1, verse 23, and I'm putting that on my website. I put up Codex Bazer up there, and also minuscule number 2, which James White doesn't mention, which has the reading of Bazer, which Erasmus used. So they would have known about this and that it had a different reading. So, but they're like, oh no, he got it from Codex D. And it's like, well, yeah, it's in Codex D, but also what about this other manuscript? And so they never mention that. So usually it's just, don't mention, anything to do in favor of the other guys, just demonization.
Since within a few decades, a very weakly attested reading is turned into the received one. Bazer actually does not hide the fact that the reading is weakly attested, but it remains.
But it was the received one. It was received in the Latin. It was received. It became received, and so, and this is one of the things where I'm going to explain to you at the end about Matthew chapter 1, verse 23, and why I believe that this is just basically a place where, in the context, it makes it plural. But if you were to take the word by itself, it would be singular or plural, depending on which reading. But I'm going to explain a little bit about it, and so, but we just want to finish James White here.
It's remarkable that he can treat a reading adopted by himself as received.
But it wasn't
received. Received by whom? And
received by the people who were doing, all the people who were buying his Latin translation for the next 300 years. So, okay.
What caught my attention here was that so many of these young guys that are buying into, hey, if all I've got's this, then I don't have to worry about textual criticism anymore, and I can just preach this, and I don't have to worry about those footnotes. It's the received text, after all. Received by whom?
Okay, so he's not talking about the received remark of Bazer there, he's talking about the received text. Received, okay, by pretty much the Complutensian guys, Erasmus in his 5 editions, Tyndale, Martin Luther, John Calvin, Stephanus in his 4 editions, Theodore Bazer, I think he did 11 editions all up, the King James Version translators, Diodotti, Italian, the Spanish in the Bear Bible, leading up to other editions, which I can't remember what they're called, Swedish, but every translation of that era based upon a Greek text. Every translation right up until even the Bible Society started with a TR. It's like, what's James White talking about? Should we call it the unreceived text? What's he waffling on about? It was received. It was the received text. This comes from. It's a bit like I picture someone like Sam Gipp. Sometimes he'll have just a quick answer, but it's not really good. And James White he's developed this really big sort of theory around just a quick answer, which is like the received text. That's just an advertising blurb at the beginning of the Elzevir's brothers' Bible, their uncle and nephew. But they wrote, this is the text received by all. Were they lying? No. Who else? Was there this rival Greek text at the time? No. It was a text received by all. And people were translating from it. Dutch Bible based upon it, King James based upon it. It was received by all. So why? He's basically had this argument for so long. It's like the received text is wrong. Received text is right. Now he's just looking for even someone has received text, Jan Kranz. He's like, look, he's saying it's received. By whom? And then he's like, this received text label that's on all the Greek manuscripts for 300 years. Who received it? It's like, everyone? What are you waffling on about, James? It is the received text, the Textus Receptus. Even guys like Metzger admit that's all they had. And even James White admits it. He'll say, but that's all they had. It's an accident of history. That's all they had at the time. It's like, but that means they received that text. It's like, what's he waffling on about? But anyway.
Received by whom, guys?
Who? Everyone?
I mean, if Bazer can refer to a reading that he himself adopted,
but wasn't he the premier guru of that era for Bibles? Wasn't he hanging around the upper echelon of scholarship? Wasn't he writing to many other scholars? And he was the main guy in Geneva. He headed the Geneva Bible. He has some weight, James. You just think he's just some dimwit who's, I'm just doing some Greek project on the side and I don't even care about the Greek. I just care about the Latin. And, he's just some idiot. No, he is probably the best guy in Europe at the time doing this stuff. So this is where James assumes that people are like him. Unlearned, unscholarly, and just full of hot air. And he just puts this into Bazer, into Erasmus, and they're slipping on banana peels, and they're the Three Stooges again.
Kranz points out a couple of times where, the difference between 1516 and 1535, that's 19 years. You forget what you did 19 years ago.
Just had a senior moment, All of the information that Theodore Bazer had, he was writing it all down. If you see, say his 1582 edition, he had his 1565, and he just had tons of notes. And so he was basically going through, crossing things out, and that was what was brought to print. And so he didn't read his own notes. What are you trying to say, James? After 19 years, he just had a senior moment and went, I can't remember this reading. And it's like, no, he was writing down tons of things. He had a team of guys. The printers would have even known. They would have brought it up. It's not like you, James, working on your little books and stuff. These were the top-notch scholars of Europe. Like when you look at the sciences, you look at someone like Albert Einstein and you say, wow, what a brilliant guy. This when it came to linguistics, biblical understanding, theology, translation, methodology, Theodore Bazer was second to none. Headed the Geneva Bible, headed it. His Greek text became the basis of the King James Bible. But he was just a dimwit. And 19 years later, don't know what I'm doing. I can't read it. Mate, it's just all Greek to me. How stupid.
There were times that Erasmus thought that Greek manuscripts supported his reading when that was where he had messed up 15 years earlier and just didn't realize it.
So Erasmus did that too. I mean, back then, people were just dumb. But now, we've got computers. It's like, this is just, it's so dumb. It just, that's why I'm just it just annoys me so much.
Bazer did the same thing. So now Bazer calls a reading that he thinks should be there the received reading when it wasn't received by anybody but himself.
So no one else read read Bazer. No one worked from his text. No one, I mean, he dedicated his whole work to Queen Elizabeth. People read it, people knew it, people for years and years, for next 200 years, anyone who had anything to do with translations or manuscript, they're writing, Theodore Bezer said this, Theodore Bezer said that, because he became the number one guy. and James White's just like, no one received it. It's just him. As if he's just made this edition and it's like, oh, well, that's just going to sit in the cupboard and I'll get that out 19 years later and I'll write this thing. And it's like, I can't remember what I did there. I'm sure that the people who were translating his material and using his material and all the scholars around him, if he stuffed up that big, would come and say, hey, Bezer, you've messed up here. I mean, you just look at the flack that Erasmus copped, slanderously many times, about certain readings that were in his text. Bezer, it was the same. He had people scouring over his material. The whole of Geneva, he was the head. It's like he's become the new John Calvin, and so. It's a bit like me going into John Calvin's work and just saying he had no idea what he was doing. 1 minute he's writing this one thing, and next minute, it's 20 years later. He's lost his mind by now. He's getting old, and just like these other guys before him, and just to slander someone like that is huge. But as we've seen all the way through this, it's just one slander after another after another. We've got about 5 minutes.
And that's the other thing, but it says Kalesusi in the TR. Right, because there's still a next step of interpretation, which is going to be the King James translators. So they have to decide between Beza and Stephanos and Erasmus and so on and so forth. But Beza and Erasmus, numerous times, in their annotations and their comments said, leave it to the reader. It could be this. It could be that. Man, we do that today.
Where exactly does it say just leave it to the reader? And that's the thing, has it been misinterpreted by Crowns to make it look like that's what it's saying? And James White's just like, that's what it says, because, James White can't read the Latin. And so, or is it just James White's just sort of come up with that, and this is the thing, you can't trust these guys. These guys have just lost their scholarly trust. And so just as much as someone writing a book about Nostradamus and they've got a barrow to push and a book to sell, I trust them about as much as that. And so, yes, I might be able to grab the Latin and, sort of try to work it out, but it's like not their translation of it. And so, and because James White's not saying, okay, on this page he says this and he says that, it's just like this, oftentimes he's just saying, you guys just make up, you decide between this reading and that reading. It's like, no, I'm sure that these scholars would have said, this, this is a former reading. This is the latest, understanding of, we've looked at a whole bunch of stuff. And I think the reader will read this and understand that that's the one to go with, not just pick and choose. It's just choose your own adventure. So he's trying to make it out. But that's the CBGM. That's the choose your own adventure. It's like all the variants at the bottom of the page at the Nestle Aland United Bible Society text. Choose your own adventure. Choose a variant. I like that reading better. We'll go with it. Do a translation on that. That's what he's accusing these guys of doing, because he's used to that sort of stuff and he has to work that out in his mind. He's just throwing it onto these guys. That's what they're doing.
And you're casting doubt on the word of God and all the rest of this type of stuff. They did it all the time.
All the time.
They did it all the time. So it just struck me that here Beza could go, the received reading.
It's a big deal.
Received by whom? Over what period of time? Based on what? Erasmus.
The first edition that he's quoting from is a Latin Bible. Then he's got the Greek, Latin, and the Vulgate. And that's when he's saying the receive reading. And so he's comparing apples and oranges for starters. But, he's just grabbed onto this receive reading thing and just running with it, and just whatever comes to his mind is coming out of his mouth.
Had a significantly more developed textual critical methodology. That is an interest in manuscripts. Not so much manuscripts. Nobody really had an interest in manuscripts.
Nobody had an interest in manuscripts. Nobody had an interest in manuscripts. Look, I mean, just seriously, like this would have to be one of the most illiterate things I've ever heard about the Reformers. I mean, he was just talking about Codex Bazer, named after Bazer, a 5th century manuscript that apparently he can't read in the marginal notes of Stephanus. He can't tell the difference between that and what's in front of him. And he thinks there's 2 readings, apparently, but they never read manuscripts. He just said that they did. This is, I mean, do I have to explain? Erasmus, brilliant Renaissance scholar, read a ton of Greek manuscripts, Latin manuscripts, Stephanus, he's got a list of manuscripts that he checked. Bazer, he talks in depth about different manuscripts and even other different languages, Syriac and Hebrew and Latin, and it's like the King James translators are all surrounded by manuscripts, but apparently none of them, not one person. This is just, I mean, I've been doing these videos for about 2 or 3 years now, and this would have to be one of the dumbest things I've ever heard. I mean, this is up there with flat Earth, up there with, when you hear flat Earth things and they're amazed and you go, oh my God, this is amazing. It's like just so dumb. And I'm just gobsmacked, absolutely gobsmacked, but we'll continue. It's still got
at this point.
a bit of time.
Much more of an interest in the scribal activities. Erasmus.
So you got no interest in manuscripts, but it's all about scribal activities. How can you look at someone's scribal activity and not be interested in the manuscripts? What is he talking about?
Went much more into depth into various kinds of scribal errors. Bazer just sort of lumped them all into marginal glosses that ended up being brought into the text, something like that.
Something like that. Yeah. Man, I mean, James really needs to read this book through and then go and study it for himself. He's just sort of like, I'm halfway through the book and it says this, and the next thing he says is this. He's not really thinking about it or evaluating it. He's just taking this as gospel. Anyway.
In fact, what's fascinating, in his first edition, Bazer individually identifies the various manuscripts that Stephanus lists, and then he goes, it's too much of a bother. I'm just going to say in certain manuscripts. So you don't even know which one he's referring to. He became...
So he had to go through and constantly list it all the way through his annotations, or like what happened, let's say Revelation 16:5, he has written in-depth detail things, and then later on he says, go back and read what I've said there, and you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. And so with Revelation 16:5, it says, go and read my notes in Revelation chapter 1, verse 4. So when I read that, I went, okay, I went back and I read it. I was like, it makes sense. And all the way through, wherever there's the triadic declaration in the book of Revelation, he says, go back to Revelation 1:4. I talk about it. So he has to grab that and put all that information in each place? That's just lazy scholarship. It's just, and I'm not sure if that's exactly how he does with these manuscripts, but knowing James White and his misreads Bezer on his notes and just basically grabs a soundbite and says, I restored the text, and it's like, that's all he says, and then he doesn't really read the context, doesn't go back and read, the other place where it's talking about it, and it's like, we know that he's done this, we know that he's dishonest on this, or just lazy as a scholar. So, we'll let him continue.
Less specific over time, rather than more specific. They don't care about what manuscripts they are, what quality they are. There's no analysis of any of these things that we...
They don't care. So, say when Erasmus looked at Vaticanus, he probably looked at it in Rome. I don't know that. That's just speculation, but he was, one of the main scholars of the world, and he was in Rome when Rome was flooded with manuscripts, and, what's stopping one of the greatest scholars in the world from going to the Vatican Library and looking for Codex Vaticanus? Nothing. But even if he didn't do that, he's looked at it through Bombastus and other people, and so he's studying manuscripts. And so he's looking at these things, looking at manuscripts, looking at, evaluating. And so I'm just going to go back 15 seconds there because we want to make sure that we cover everything.
To a brother, I'm just going to say in certain manuscripts, so you don't even know which one he's referring to. He became less specific over time, rather than more specific. They don't care about what manuscripts they are, what quality they are. There's no analysis of any of these things that we do regularly.
So they didn't look at, like, Codex Vaticanus and evaluate and go, that's rubbish. They didn't look at, Codex D and go, well, there's a few readings here and there that are interesting, but it's like, no, even James White says that when Bazer had sort of finished with that manuscript, he sent it to England and said, don't translate from this. It's a bit all over the place. What do you call that? They're categorizing manuscripts, good, bad. It's like going through the fruit bucket and go, that's a good one, that's a bad one. What more can they do?
In textual criticism today, it's not present. It's not present. And this is why fundamentally, when you push on all these things, the only logical place for the TR guys to go is to abandon any historical battle at all and to completely theologize this. To create a theology of providential preservation, and I'm just simply going to say, this is it. That's what Doug Wilson did. When I pushed him in the book, which one? 1550 Stephanos. Why? Because it looks good. That's all you can do. There's no, you don't have a methodology that can actually answer that question. You just have to just go, 1550 Stephanos. That's what we're going to go with. That's all you've got. You don't have anything else. Don't pretend you've got something you don't have.
Well, Doug Wilson did this, and a lot of people were like, oh, okay, that's weird. But I know some people do that every now and then. They're like 1550, or, I used to be like 1598 of Bazer until I personally went through all the differences between Scrivener 1598 and the King James Bible. And now I've come to the exact same conclusion as Edward Hills, that it's the underlying text of the King James Version. And so that never got printed. So there's about 20 differences between that and the text of Theodore Bazer, which is almost like absolutely splitting hairs. But and that's the position of the Dean Burgon Society, of people like David Cloud. And so it's a more popular position. It's probably the main TR position. But he's bringing up Doug Wilson. Doug Wilson said that, blah, blah. And so, yeah, okay. A lot of people looked at what Doug Wilson said there, and might get a handful of people who follow that, but most don't. Probably 95% of TR people I've talked to don't follow that. And so,
you don't have any basis for saying 1550 versus the third edition of Erasmus versus the second edition of Bazer, or finally the Trinitarian Bible side. Why not just do what Peter Ruckman did? Peter Ruckman described a process of purification all the way through to the Schofield Reference Bible. That's the final stage of the process of the purification of the text. Why not do that? It has as much basis in history. It's all just a leap of faith that says, well, I'm going to identify this one. That's right.
And so there is the whole concept of Erasmus, Complutensian guys doing something, Erasmus doing something, Stephanus doing something, Bazer, and then the King James guys working on all that. There is that, whole concept of purification. And then when you look at trying to get printing errors out of the most popular book ever, just King James Bible just printed left, right, and center in America and Australia and South Africa, printed everywhere. And so, of course, there's going to be print errors and, the odd word that's changed here and there. And so that process was refined, but basically the text is unchanged. It's 1611. And so I would rather have that scenario than no Bible. Where was your Bible, James, in the Reformation? Sitting on a shelf in the Vatican? Codex Vaticanus? And these dumb reformers just looked at it and went, I don't know about that. And they should have recognised it and done what Westcott and Hort did. And, but then we had to wait for St. Atticus to come along and for liberal Tischendorf to work all that out. And which scenario would you rather have? Something that's been preserved and, looking at it and it's like, we've printed, 1 billion King James Bibles and there's a few errors in, one says she and the other one says he. What are we going to do? It's like, we'll work that out, and it's like, it's pretty easy to go through and look at the Greek beforehand and work these things out. And he's just like, that's a Peter Ruckman idea. It's like, well, he has no idea. Here in Australia, we were King James only for about 100 years. He has no idea. We are part of the Commonwealth. We're a representative government under a monarchy. We still have a queen here. We're like Canada. Now, when there was basically only Catholics and Protestants, back in the day, the only authorised and official Bible that was allowed to be in Australia was the authorised version for about 100 years. And also it had to be this specific prayer book, the Psalms and the prayer book that the Anglican Church used. And that was it. If you had anything else, you'd get fined, you'd be in trouble, you could be imprisoned. And so we were King James only for 100 years here in Australia. James White just seems to think that the King James Bible was just, because he's like, it's Peter Ruckman and it's all these other lunatics, and he's starting to believe the sewage that's coming out of his mouth. He's starting to actually believe his own bull dust. I shouldn't get too crass, but he believes what's coming out of his mouth, and he's starting to, King James is just so dumb, and these other guys are dumb as well, and he has no basis for saying that. It's been well respected in America, in Australia, any English-speaking place. They go, King James is just the best. And so it takes someone like James White with all of his fanciful stories to turn you off it.
I'm going to put my foot down here, boom, and then just defend that one. But you don't defend it historically. Don't even bother to defend it. So you have no reason to defend it.
It's the only text we can actually defend historically. Your text wasn't in existence. It's like, okay, James, show us the text that you would defend in the Reformation. There's none. No one's printing it. It's not received by anyone. It's disappeared.
Historically. Just simply say, nope, I can't answer those questions. I can't talk about where it came from. I can't talk about how Erasmus came up with the reading or Bazer came up. It doesn't matter. I'm just simply taking this as my final authority.
No,
and I think
through scholarship.
I can't tell you why.
We can tell you why.
I have said from the start.
We've told James White why, and he won't accept it. I personally saw him face to face and said, James, I'm the guy you've been talking about on your program. Here is my answer to the Revelation 16:5 thing. He said, I refuse to take it. and he refuses to read it. So it's like, here's the answers, James. You're saying we don't have an answer. No, he just wants to pretend that we don't have an answer. We do. Well, there are people out there who have, bothered to go through his stuff, and like, it takes a bit of effort to go through like a video like this and sort of clean up the mess, but let alone just actually write out a scholarly article that will refute what he's saying. But he won't even read it. It's just not, and he announced that he's never going to read it. It's like, but he challenged me to write it. It's like, okay, James. I guess maybe you're the one who's scared. He's like, Gene Kim and his followers, they're too scared to listen to a program like this. So I'm not too scared. I think your program would be a lot more interesting if you actually just stuck to, things that were true and said the truth instead of lying and misrepresenting people, misrepresenting me, saying I've got the mindset of a Mormon, I'm just like Muhammad, I can't deal with the truth, and I'm dealing with it. I'm doing shows on it. You're the one who is not dealing with the truth. You're the one who is misrepresenting me, like ad hom argumentation. He didn't know me from a bar of soap, but he was straight away saying, I'm dangerous, don't listen to what he's saying. And I was just like, man, this is pretty amazing. It's interesting to be on the other end of James White and to see what he will say. A few more minutes.
This movement is absolutely destructive to any meaningful apologetics.
You can't.
Because it is.
Preach to anyone. Have to have a
that's all there is to
Good News Bible or
anyway,
NIV.
So Matthew 1:23. There are others we can look at. Luke 2:22 and text in Ephesians we'll get to eventually. But over time we will get to those. How do you in one webcast go from talking about social justice, critical theory, the homosexual representative in Pennsylvania attacking people outside abortion clinics, to a discussion of the difference between the second person singular and the third person plural forms of kaleo in the Greek Septuagint as understood by Theodore Bazer? How many webcasts can you listen to that will take you that far? Bradley Mason said that I am, in comparing me to Tom Askell, he said, I am by far the most incendiary of everyone. And so looking at the meaning of incendiary, I said, is that why my daughter says I'm a hot mess? Maybe there's a connection there. I'm not sure. Incendiary, hot, I don't know.
So anyway, he's wrapping it up there. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to explain to you exactly why I think that Theodore Bazer chose this reading. Now, there are some readings that don't really matter which manuscript you go with. The context is king. And so one of my favorite examples is, say, Matthew chapter 10, verse 10, where you see a difference in the manuscripts between rhabdos, plural for staffs, or in the King James it's staves, like a bunch of staffs, or rhabdon, which is one staff. Okay, so what happens in context? Jesus is saying, don't take a bag and don't do this and don't do that, and he says nor staves or nor staffs, which is plural. So it's in the King James, and so you get this idea that he's saying, don't bring a multitude of sticks and staves. It's going to be a short journey. We're going to be in and out. People are going to help you along the way. So you're just going to trust in God. And other times it was like, take one. But, this time it's like, nor staves, plural. You don't take one. And so in the context, he's speaking to a bunch of people. So he's saying, don't take a staff. Now, if it's rhabdon, singular, it's just like saying phone. If I said to 20 people, don't take your phone, leave it behind, I'm actually, it's singular, but it means plural. So this is what I think's happened over the years. People are like, oh, hang on, he's sort of meaning plural there. Or just when you get that one verse and you just, put it on the blackboard sort of thing. It's like, let's focus on this. To know that it's plural, it's like, all right, we'll just make the word plural just so people know it. But I think the singular is fine there. So this is where Scrivener, so Bazer has the singular, Scrivener has the plural, because the King James makes it plural in the context in English, so that we don't have that whole thing of like, you have to do a Bible study on it sort of thing to figure it all out. In context, it was more than one staff, singular. It was staffs, and so that's why they did the plural. And so when we're reading through what Theodore Bazer did here, I don't think it matters whether it's kalesis or kalesusai. Kalesis being the reading of Bazer, or kalesusai being the reading of the majority of Greek manuscripts, but also the reading of Scrivener. I don't think it matters, because it's the context that that changes it. And so if we look at Isaiah chapter 7 verse 14, it's basically has in the King James it says, and shall call his name Emmanuel. So in the marginal note of the King James it says, a virgin ... shall call. Then it has, or thou, O virgin, shall call. So it's specifically saying the person in the context of the sentence, which is the virgin, shall call. Okay? But pretty much what's being said there, it's got the virgin, okay? And then it's just basically saying like, shall call. And so it's in the context, because it's talking with the virgin, that she shall call, okay? And what's interesting in the LXX, which we talked about earlier, but I believe there is certain benefit to looking at an old Greek translation of the Old Testament, and an AD one, most probably. The LXX has you, or thou, singular, shall call his name Emmanuel. So talking about the virgin. You shall call his name Emmanuel. So they've actually interpreted that as the singular. Thou shalt call his name Emmanuel. And then so in the King James Version of Matthew, it has they shall call his name Emmanuel. So they being the plural, lining up with kalesusai. And so, but what I think is, and so this is my own opinion, I don't really know anyone else who is throwing this about, but I think kalesis in context comes up with the same reading because of the King James marginal note. If we read the King James marginal note, it says, or they shall call his name, or his name shall be called. So what they're saying is, where it says they shall call his name, the plural, it can also be written, or his name shall be called. And so what it's saying there is, in the Greek, and I believe they were using the Greek of Bazer, this is going against Scrivener, this is going against the majority of scholarship that I've read, but I believe that the kalesis is translated plurally because of the context. And so we've seen the context in Isaiah chapter 7 verse 14 talking about the virgin shall call, but then we see in this one that it's talking about people will call his name Emmanuel. And so it's plural, God with us. It's not God with me, or with the virgin, or what, it's God with us. And so talking plurally, so this changes that singular into a plural. And so I think over time, for people to understand that verse in its singular setting, they've actually made it plural in the Greek, so that people don't, a bit like what we've got in the King James, they shall call his name Emmanuel, where people don't get confused and say, no, it says, thou shalt call his name Emmanuel. It's still just talking to Joseph sort of thing. Where it's more so 2 verses earlier, the exact same word is in the singular. You shall call his name Jesus. Singular, thou shalt call his name Jesus, and he shall save his people from their sins. Where here it's they shall call, because of the context, it's in the plural. And so that's what I think's happened here. Now, if anyone has any thoughts upon that, I know that I'm probably going against most scholarship here. And the thing is, the most KJV TR people would simply just go with the plural reading, because that's what it reads in the King James, and that's the majority text reading. So it's easier to go with that. And then you don't have any fight, because that's what the critical text reads as well. Thou shalt call. So there's almost like no argument. But Bazer sort of brings this thing in and brings an argument, and I'm siding with Bazer. So I'm sort of being the stick in the mud saying, no, I actually think this is what happened. And so I've got to really go back through and look at Bazer's notes, and so I'm basically just going to collect his notes from the 1556 Latin that he did, and then go down through to his 1598 or his annotations, and collect all that information, look at differences, a bit like what Kranz has done, but he's sort of focusing on different things. And I'm just going to look at the Latin, look at the Greek, and work out basically an easier way to say it than I've just said it, or a more documented way of saying it. Because what I think is the key thing here is, in the King James, there's a marginal note at Isaiah 7:14, and there's a marginal note at Matthew chapter 1 verse 23. And so we see this marginal notes says in the first one, a virgin shall call, or thou, O virgin, shall call. So in context, it's the virgin and singular. And then in the LXX, it basically has made it kalesis, which is, thou, is singular, you shall call. So it sort of matches in with that. And then in Matthew, you got the plural. They shall call, but I think that if kalesis is used, it becomes plural in the context of you shall call. And so that's one of the things, is who is the you? The you is a group of people. And so is it going back to the you of the people who are in Isaiah, or is it going back to the virgin? Is it going back to Joseph? Is it going back to Israel? Is it going back to Matthew? So that's the thing where I've got to document all that. But that's where I'm heading in my thoughts. And so if I was to do a modern Greek Bible, I would just go with the plural, okay? But if I was to do a Bible, like a Textus Receptus edition, I would stick with Bazer's reading and basically explain what's happened. And so hopefully that helps you to understand where I'm coming from there. If you go to my website, tr.org.au, you can look up Matthew chapter 1, verse 23. I've got a whole bunch of stuff there. Some of it's all over the place, but I'm trying to line it up so it's easy to follow. If you've got any information you want to send me, if you found some stuff that people have written, I've got quotes by Edward Hills there. I've got Jan Kranz's stuff there. Whole bunch of stuff. Erasmus, Theodore Bazer, Scrivener. Got Scrivener's annotations. I've got all the earlier English Bibles with they shall call, thou shalt call, they shall call, they shall call, and the LXX, Geneva Bible. It's interesting, the Geneva Bible has they shall call in the main text with a marginal note, or thou. And so is that just an acceptable reading? It's either they or thou, but in context it becomes plural, This is one of the things where sometimes, I remember there was even in Revelation chapter, and now I've looked this up twice and it's taken me quite a while, and I'm really sorry, but I'm just about to close this up. But I'll just go to Revelation chapter 13, where it talks about, and they shall receive a mark. I'll just jump into that chapter and show you the Greek. Actually, the marginal note will be to receive. I think it's verse 16 of chapter 13. The marginal note in the 1611 for where it says, and he causeth all, both small and great, rich and poor, free and bond, to receive. So when you receive something, you're taking it. To receive a mark in their right hand or in their forehead, right hand forehead. Okay, so they're receiving it. That's the, and most versions go with that. But in the margin, it has, the Greek means to give. So it actually sort of says, rich and poor, free and slave, to give a mark in their right hand. It's almost like the opposite. You're giving instead of receiving. But they've put that there to basically say, look, in the Greek, you got to understand Greek. You got to understand it in context. You got to understand idioms and things like that to understand that it's saying receive. In English, that's how it would be said. But you can get confused if you just look at the Greek. It says to give. And people might translate it that way. That's why they put the marginal note there. So the reason I'm pointing that out is because sometimes there are things in Greek, like I was talking about rabdon and rabdos and staffs, plural and stuff. Now, either way, you're pretty much going to come up with the same thing in the King James or any translation. I know, like, say, in the King James is plural. In the King James Version 2000 edition, it's singular, staff. But then it creates a thing where it doesn't match up with what's in Mark and what's in the others. And because it's in context, it's plural. But in the Greek, it's singular. And so that's one of the things where, that can cause confusion, and we've got to know these things. And so anyway, hopefully that's helped you to understand where I'm coming from with this. And so I've sort of figured that out quite a few years ago. I had to refresh my memory on all this. And, like Theodore Bazer and Erasmus, I just had this senior moment and I didn't remember what I'd done, But luckily I wrote it down so I could figure it all out again. But anyway, I'm going to split. And so thanks for joining us, guys. If you've got any information you want to send me, if you want to help me do these studies, sometimes I can spend, an hour on some Latin thing. It takes up a lot of my time. But if it's already done for me, then I can use that as a launching pad. And so if you've got anything you want to send me or anything you want me to do to study through and go through, just let me know. God bless you guys, and I'll see you later on.